Before we begin our journey into the shadowy life of one of America's most powerful yet unknown crime bosses, I must pause for a critical moment. The story you are about to hear is a synthesis of historical records, declassified government documents, court testimonies, and published accounts from journalists and investigators. It is a narrative pieced together from countless sources, some reliable, some speculative. My sole purpose in presenting this to you is to deliver a comprehensive and compelling account of a fascinating and dark chapter in American history. This is not a work of fiction, but it is also not the final, absolute truth, as the full truth of Russell Bufalino's world died with those who lived in it. I urge you to view this as a historical exploration, a story designed to inform and captivate. If you choose to join me on this deep dive into the life of the Quiet Don, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more detailed explorations of forgotten histories. Now, let us step back in time, to the dusty roads of Sicily, where our story begins. The world of organized crime in 20th century America is often painted in broad, loud strokes, defined by the violent theatrics of Al Capone in Chicago or the flamboyant arrogance of John Gotti in New York. These men became celebrities in their own right, their faces splashed across newspapers, their names synonymous with brazen power and a shocking disregard for the law. But this popular understanding is a distraction, a sleight of hand that draws the public eye towards the spectacular explosion while ignoring the patient, meticulous hands that laid the fuse and controlled the burn. The true power in the American underworld was not held by those who sought the spotlight, but by those who mastered the art of the shadow, men for whom anonymity was a strategic weapon more potent than any machine gun. And in this hidden pantheon of invisible emperors, few were more consequential, more quietly dominant, or more utterly enigmatic than Russell Alfred Bufalino. His story is the antithesis of the American gangster myth. It is a lesson in how real, enduring influence is cultivated not through noise, but through silence, not through fear alone, but through unbreakable loyalty and strategic patience. To understand Russell Bufalino is to understand that the most dangerous currents in the ocean are not the crashing waves on the surface, but the deep, silent, and relentless undertows that pull destinies from afar. His journey begins not in the crowded tenements of New York City, but in the sun-baked, rugged hills of Sicily, a place where the concept of omerta, the code of silence, was not a choice but a centuries-old necessity for survival. Born on September 25, 1903, in the small town of Montedoro, in the province of Caltanissetta, Rosario Alfredo Bufalino entered a world defined by poverty, a deep-seated mistrust of external authority, and a fierce reliance on family and local allegiances. This Sicilian culture, forged by successive waves of foreign conquest and exploitation, bred a particular worldview where the state was an enemy to be circumvented and where justice was a personal matter, administered by one's own. It was this foundational environment that shaped the core of Bufalino's character, instilling in him the values that would define his entire life: discretion, patience, and an unshakable belief in the primacy of personal relationships over any abstract law. When he was just a young boy, his family, like millions of others, made the arduous decision to seek a new life across the Atlantic, joining the great wave of southern Italian immigration that flooded into the United States at the turn of the century. They arrived in Pennsylvania, not in the industrial hubs of Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, but in the rugged coal mining and textile region of the northeastern part of the state, an area that would become the unlikely seat of a vast criminal empire. The Bufalinos settled in the small city of Pittston, a place that, while geographically in America, was culturally and socially a direct extension of their Sicilian villages. Here, the old ways held firm, the language, the traditions, and the intricate social codes of the homeland were preserved with a tenacious grip. Young Russell, later Americanizing his name from Rosario, grew up in this tight-knit, insular community, an experience that further reinforced his innate inclination towards secrecy and clan loyalty. He did not yearn for the glittering skyscrapers of Manhattan. He understood that in the unassuming brick row houses and social clubs of Pittston, Scranton, and Wilkes-Barre, he could operate with a freedom and impunity that his flashier counterparts in the big cities could only dream of. His first foray into legitimate work was as a tailor, a trade that required precision, patience, and a keen eye for detail, qualities that would become the hallmarks of his criminal career. He learned how to cut cloth and stitch seams, but more importantly, he learned how to read people, to measure them, and to understand the subtle fabrics of power and influence that wove his community together. It was in these early years, working quietly with his hands, that Bufalino began to build the network of relationships that would form the bedrock of his power. He was not a brash young thug, He was a listener, an observer, a young man who understood that information was a currency more valuable than gold. He forged connections with other young Sicilian immigrants, men like Joseph Barbara from nearby Endicott, New York, who would become a lifelong associate and whose home would later become the unlikely epicenter of a national scandal. He aligned himself with the established Sicilian criminal figures in the area, learning the intricate hierarchies and unspoken rules of the nascent American Mafia, or Cosa Nostra. His rise was not meteoric. It was gradual, almost geological. He earned respect not by eliminating his enemies in a hail of gunfire, but by proving himself to be reliable, discreet, and impeccably loyal. He handled tasks, settled disputes, and facilitated arrangements, always with a calm demeanor and an unwavering commitment to the code he had absorbed from birth. While other gangsters were building reputations, Russell Bufalino was building an infrastructure, a web of trust, obligation, and mutual interest that was far more resilient and powerful than any reputation built on fear alone. He was cultivating a persona that would become his greatest asset, that of the quiet, unassuming, and utterly indispensable man in the background. The man who could get things done without ever raising his voice or drawing attention to himself. This was the foundation, laid brick by silent brick in the soot-stained cities of Pennsylvania, upon which an empire of astonishing reach and influence would be built, an empire that would, from this seemingly insignificant corner of America, extend its tendrils into the highest corridors of power and the most pivotal events of the mid-20th century. The transition from the tailor's shop to the inner sanctums of the burgeoning criminal underworld was not a sudden leap for Russell Bufalino, but a seamless and logical progression, a natural evolution of his skills applied to a different, more lucrative kind of fabric. The Prohibition era, which began in 1920, served as the perfect catalyst for men of his particular talents, transforming local neighborhood toughs into sophisticated, nationwide smuggling entrepreneurs. While the Volstead Act was intended to morally uplift the nation, it instead created a vast, illegal economy that demanded organization, logistics, and a ruthless capacity for enforcement, all areas where Bufalino and his associates excelled. Northeastern Pennsylvania, with its dense forests, complex network of backroads, and relative proximity to major cities like New York and Philadelphia, became a critical bootlegging corridor. Canadian whiskey and domestically produced moonshine flowed through this region like water, and Bufalino quickly positioned himself as a key orchestrator of this flow. This was his postgraduate education in illicit enterprise, moving beyond local disputes to master large-scale logistics, revenue management, and inter-family diplomacy. The lessons learned here were foundational. He saw how a product in demand could be supplied through a vertically integrated operation, from production to transportation to distribution, all protected by a web of corrupted officials and the implicit threat of violence. It was during this time that he solidified his alliance with the Magadino crime family of Buffalo, New York, a relationship that would provide him with crucial external support and expand his influence beyond the confines of Pennsylvania. He was no longer just a respected local figure, he was now a strategic partner in a multi-state criminal consortium. More importantly, Prohibition taught him the immense power of controlling a vital artery of commerce. While the bootlegging of alcohol was a temporary, if highly profitable, phenomenon, the principle was eternal. He who controls the pipeline controls the profit. This insight would become the central tenet of his entire criminal philosophy. When Prohibition ended in 1933, many gangsters were left scrambling, their primary revenue stream suddenly dried up. But for the forward-thinking Bufalino, it was merely an opportunity to pivot. He had already been diversifying, building on the capital and connections amassed during the dry years. He moved into gambling, establishing intricate numbers rackets and illegal betting operations that preyed on the hopes and desperation of the working-class communities he knew so well. He expanded into loan sharking, providing juice loans at exorbitant interest rates to those who could not access traditional banks, trapping them in a cycle of debt and servitude that often provided him with not just financial returns, but also a steady stream of compelled informants and enforcers. Yet, his most significant and enduring move was his calculated entry into the world of labor racketeering. He recognized that in the burgeoning industrial heartland of America, the real power did not lie in manufacturing goods, but in controlling the movement of those goods and the workers who produced them. He began a quiet, relentless campaign to infiltrate the labor unions, starting with local chapters in the garment and trucking industries that were the lifeblood of his region. Through a combination of strategic violence, clever negotiation, and the corruption of union officials, he began to place his own men in positions of influence. This was not about securing better wages or working conditions for the rank and file. It was about gaining a stranglehold over entire industries. By controlling a union, he could dictate terms to business owners, pay a tax for labor peace, or face devastating strikes, sabotage, and the mysterious disappearance of your shipments. This was a more sophisticated, more insidious, and far more profitable form of extortion than any street-level shakedown. It was during this period of consolidation and expansion in the 1930s and 1940s that Bufalino truly became the quiet Don. He established his base of operations not in a flashy nightclub, but in a modest office above a restaurant in Pittston, a space that belied the immense power he wielded. He became a creature of habit, a man known for his unremarkable appearance, his calm demeanor, and his preference for whispered conversations in dimly lit social clubs. He avoided the press, shunned photographs, and conducted his business with a level of discretion that made him a ghost in the very machine he was building. While the national media was obsessed with the bloody internal wars of New York's 5 families, Bufalino was quietly forging his own, tightly knit criminal organization, often referred to as the Bufalino crime family, though its structure was more a reflection of his personal authority than a formal, hierarchical entity. He ruled not through terror, though he was capable of utter ruthlessness, but through a network of deep, personal loyalties. He was a man of his word, and he expected the same in return. A betrayal was not just a business dispute, it was a personal affront, and the consequences were swift, final, and utterly silent. This reputation for reliability and discretion, coupled with his growing economic power, made him a sought-after intermediary, a trusted fixer for the larger, more chaotic crime families in New York. He became the man they turned to when they needed a delicate situation handled, a dispute resolved without bloodshed, or a complex logistical problem solved. This role as an underworld diplomat and logistical mastermind elevated his status from a regional power broker to a figure of national significance within the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia. He was the calm, rational voice in a room full of volatile egos, the man who could see the long game when others were blinded by short-term ambition. It was this unique position, a boss with a small but incredibly loyal crew, operating from an unassuming power base, and trusted by the most powerful criminal entities in the country, that set the stage for his involvement in some of the most infamous and consequential events of the coming decades. Events that would stretch from the coal fields of Pennsylvania to the casinos of Las Vegas and even into the clandestine corridors of the Central Intelligence Agency. The true measure of Russell Bufalino's power and the national reach of his influence was starkly revealed not through a triumphant display of his own making, but through a single, catastrophic miscalculation that erupted into public view on a cold November afternoon in 1957, an event that would forever be known as the Apalachin Summit. 4 decades, the existence of a centralized, national organized crime syndicate had been largely dismissed by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover as media hysteria. But that denial was shattered when a New York State Trooper, Sergeant Edgar Croswell, acting on a hunch and a tip about a large gathering of expensive cars at the rural estate of Joseph Barbara in Apalachin, New York, decided to set up a roadblock. Barbara, a wealthy beverage distributor, was a known associate of Bufalino, and his secluded property had long been suspected as a meeting place for underworld figures. What Croswell stumbled upon that day, November 14, 1957, was nothing less than a convention of the American Mafia's high command, a gathering of over 100 bosses, underbosses, and captains from across the United States, from New York to Florida, from the Midwest to the East Coast. The intended agenda of this meeting, held just months after the assassination of Albert Anastasia, the notorious boss of Murder Incorporated, was likely to discuss the new leadership structure in New York, the burgeoning narcotics trade, and other national affairs of their illicit empire. For Bufalino, this was a moment of supreme validation. His presence there, alongside titans like Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, and Santo Trafficante Jr., confirmed his status as a peer, a man whose counsel was sought on the most critical issues facing the underworld. But as the police presence grew, panic ensued. Dignified, well-dressed men in silk suits and fedoras suddenly scrambled like frightened animals, fleeing into the surrounding woods, discarding their wallets and jewelry in a desperate attempt to avoid identification. Some were caught trying to wade across a stream, others were found hiding in the brush, their expensive shoes caked in mud. Bufalino himself was among the dozens detained and humiliatingly processed that day. The public spectacle was a disaster for the secretive world of La Cosa Nostra. Newspaper headlines screamed about the mob convention, and the myth of a non-existent national crime syndicate was instantly vaporized. forcing J. Edgar Hoover's hand and finally prompting the FBI to launch a serious, sustained war on organized crime. For the more flamboyant bosses, this was a public relations catastrophe. But for a man like Bufalino, whose entire power base was predicated on invisibility, it was a near-fatal blow. His name, once known only to a select few in law enforcement and the underworld, was now splashed across the nation's newspapers, forever linking the quiet, unassuming man from Pittston to the highest echelons of the mob. Yet, in a testament to his resilience and the deep layers of insulation he had built around himself, the immediate legal consequences for Bufalino were minimal. He was questioned and released, and while the event made him a person of intense interest to federal authorities, they found it nearly impossible to build a substantive case against him. He had no criminal record of any significance, he operated through layers of intermediaries, and he committed nothing to paper. The Apalachin meeting, while a stunning intelligence coup for law enforcement, also revealed the fundamental challenge of prosecuting a man like Bufalino. Knowing he was a powerful gangster was one thing, proving it in a court of law was an entirely different matter. He simply returned to his modest office in Pennsylvania and continued his business, albeit under significantly increased scrutiny. The aftermath of Apalachin also had a profound impact on the mob's internal culture. It taught them a brutal lesson in operational security. Large, centralized meetings of that scale were never again attempted. Communication and decision-making became even more decentralized and secretive, relying on trusted messengers and clandestine one-on-one meetings, a method of operation that Bufalino had always preferred. In a strange way, the disaster at Apalachin validated his entire philosophy of quiet, distributed control. While other bosses licked their wounds and cursed their bad luck, Bufalino adapted, retreating even deeper into the shadows, perfecting his methods of communication and control. The notoriety from Apalachin was an unwelcome spotlight, but it did not illuminate the full, terrifying scope of his operations. It was a flashlight beam on a single tree in a vast, dark forest. The real extent of his power, the connections that truly mattered, remained hidden, operating through channels that were completely invisible to the FBI agents now dutifully adding his name to their watch lists. This hidden network was about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined, as Bufalino's world was on the verge of intersecting with one of the most powerful institutions in the United States, an alliance so bizarre and clandestine that it would remain largely hidden from the American public for decades, an alliance between the Central Intelligence Agency and the American Mafia, with Russell Bufalino positioned as a critical, if silent, linchpin in a plot to change the course of world history. The convergence of Russell Bufalino's criminal empire with the highest levels of the United States government stands as one of the most extraordinary and unsettling chapters in the annals of American history, a stark illustration of how the lines between national security and criminal conspiracy can become dangerously blurred in the shadows of the Cold War. This unlikely and morally fraught alliance was born not from shared ideology, but from a shared enemy, Fidel Castro. Following his successful revolution in Cuba in 1959, Castro quickly moved to shut down the lucrative casino and hotel operations that had been a massive source of revenue for organized crime figures like Maya Lansky and Santo Traficante Jr. The new Cuban leader's expropriation of these assets represented a catastrophic financial blow to the mob, a multi-million-dollar enterprise literally seized overnight. Simultaneously, in Washington, the Eisenhower administration, and later the Kennedy administration, viewed Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union as an intolerable threat just 90 miles from American shores. As the CIA began to explore options for removing Castro, the idea of partnering with the very mobsters who had been expelled from Cuba began to gain traction within the agency's clandestine services. The logic, however twisted, was that these men had the motivation, the operational experience in Cuba, and the utter lack of scruples necessary to carry out an assassination. It was in this toxic atmosphere of desperation and realpolitik that the figure of Russell Bufalino re-emerges, not as a triggerman, but in his classic role as a trusted connector, a guarantor of confidentiality and reliability. His close, long-standing relationship with Florida boss Santo Traficante, who had personally lost a fortune in Cuba, made him a vital node in the communication chain. Furthermore, Bufalino's reputation for impeccable discretion and his position as a respected, neutral figure on the commission made him an ideal intermediary between the CIA and the often wary mob bosses who were being asked to undertake a mission of immense risk on behalf of a government that was simultaneously trying to imprison them. While the precise details of Bufalino's involvement remain shrouded in the classified archives of the CIA and the sealed lips of the deceased, subsequent congressional investigations, most notably the Church Committee in 1975, and the testimony of key figures like mob lawyer Frank Ragano, have painted a compelling picture of his role as a facilitator. The CIA, operating through intermediaries like Robert Maheu, a former FBI agent and private investigator, needed assurances that the mob would hold up its end of the bargain and, just as importantly, remain silent forever. Bufalino was the kind of man who could provide those assurances. He was the living embodiment of omerta, a man whose word, once given, was considered an unbreakable bond within his world. His quiet endorsement of the plot would have carried immense weight with figures like Trafficante and Chicago boss Sam Giancana, lending the entire sordid enterprise a veneer of underworld legitimacy and organizational cohesion. This chapter in Bufalino's life is the ultimate expression of his power. He was now not just manipulating labor unions or corrupting local officials, he was acting as a broker in a deal that involved the sovereignty of a nation and the life of its leader. The CIA-Mafia plots, which involved multiple bizarre schemes from poisoned cigars to exploding seashells, ultimately failed to kill Castro. But their very existence reveals a profound truth about the American power structure in the mid-20th century. In certain dark corners, the government and the underworld were not always adversaries. They could be temporary, mutually suspicious partners. For Bufalino, this was the pinnacle of his influence, a moment where his carefully cultivated network of trust and his fanatical commitment to secrecy allowed him to operate on a global stage. He was, in effect, a contractor for the national security state, a paradox that defies easy categorization. This episode also highlights the stark contrast between his methods and those of his peers. There are no boastful recordings, no drunken revelations about whacking that commie Castro. The entire affair was conducted in whispers, through layers of cutouts and deniable assets, a game of shadows perfectly suited to his talents. The failure of the assassination plots did nothing to diminish his standing. If anything, it reinforced the wisdom of his methods. He had engaged with the most powerful intelligence agency in the world and walked away without a scratch, his name absent from the official records, his role known only to a handful of insiders. While the Bay of Pigs invasion failed publicly and spectacularly in 1961, the secret war against Castro, with its mob connections, continued to fester in the background, a toxic secret that would have lingering consequences, forever linking the underworld to the deep state. And for Russell Bufalino, his involvement in these world-shaking events was merely one facet of his empire, a sideline to his primary business of amassing wealth and power through the control of another, equally powerful American institution. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the largest and most powerful labor union in the world, a relationship that would be defined by one name above all others, Jimmy Hoffa. A relationship that would ultimately lead to the most famous disappearance in American history and bring the long, quiet reign of the Don to an unquiet end. The nexus of Russell Bufalino's power, the true engine room of his vast financial empire, was not built on the shifting sands of assassination plots or the fleeting profits of gambling, but on the solid, monumental foundation of organized labor, specifically his iron-fisted influence over the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. This relationship, more than any other, exemplifies the Bufalino method: patient, strategic, and operating entirely through proxies and unbreakable personal bonds. The key that unlocked the Teamsters' treasury was a familial one, a connection that demonstrated Bufalino's understanding that blood and marriage often created more reliable alliances than any business contract. His cousin, William Big Bill Medico, was a close associate, but more critically, his wife, Carolyn Medico Bufalino, was the sister of a powerful Teamsters union official in Philadelphia. This familial bridge led directly to the most powerful labor leader in America, Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa, the relentlessly ambitious and pugnacious president of the Teamsters, saw the mob as a useful ally, a source of muscle to intimidate rivals and secure his rise to power within the union. For Bufalino and the Commission, Hoffa was the ultimate prize, a man who controlled a union with over 1 million members and, most importantly, a massive, centrally controlled pension fund that held hundreds of millions of dollars in member contributions, a virtually endless reservoir of cash. The Hoffa-Bufalino alliance was a classic symbiosis of need and greed. Hoffa needed the underworld support to consolidate his power and, according to many accounts, to silence internal dissent through violence and intimidation. The mob, with Bufalino acting as a primary architect and gatekeeper, needed access to the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, a multi-billion-dollar piggy bank they were determined to crack open. Through his cousin's relationship and his own formidable powers of persuasion, Bufalino became one of Hoffa's most trusted advisors and his primary conduit to the Commission. He was the calm, steadying influence on the volatile and often reckless Hoffa, the man who could translate the mob's demands into terms the Teamster boss would understand and, more often than not, accept. This relationship granted Bufalino an unprecedented level of influence. He wasn't just a beneficiary of the pension fund, he became one of its de facto managers, a shadow trustee who decided which projects would receive loans and on what terms. This power transformed him into a kingmaker in the legitimate business world. If you wanted to build a casino in Las Vegas, a hotel in Miami, or a shopping center in California, and you couldn't secure financing through traditional banks, you went to the Teamsters pension fund. And to get that loan, you often had to go through a man like Russell Bufalino. The terms were simple. The mob would approve the loan, often at favorable interest rates, in exchange for a substantial, hidden kickback, a piece of the ownership, or the right to skim the profits through no-show jobs and sweetheart contracts with mob-controlled companies. It was a perfect, self-perpetuating cycle of corruption. The pension fund's money was used to build casinos in Las Vegas, like the Stardust and the Fremont, which were then controlled by mob fronts like Alan Glick's Argent Corporation, allowing the syndicate to siphon off millions of dollars through skimming operations before the money was ever officially counted by the state. Bufalino, from his unassuming office in Pennsylvania, was pulling the strings on a national financial network, directing the flow of capital from the pension funds of truck drivers and warehouse workers into the coffers of organized crime. This was power on a scale that made the bootlegging of his youth look like a petty street hustle. He wasn't just robbing banks, he effectively owned one. The relationship with Hoffa, however, was destined for a tragic and explosive conclusion. Hoffa's very strengths, his ambition, his defiance, his belief in his own invincibility, became his greatest liabilities. After being convicted of jury tampering and pension fraud in 1964, thanks in large part to the dogged prosecution of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Hoffa was sent to prison. From his cell, he began to see the mob's influence over his union not as a partnership, but as a parasitic infestation. He grew resentful, believing his allies had not done enough to keep him out of prison. When President Nixon commuted his sentence in 1971 on the condition he refrained from union activity until 1980, Hoffa emerged a changed man. He was furious that his handpicked successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, had grown comfortable in the role and, in Hoffa's view, had become a mere puppet for the very mob bosses Hoffa now despised. He launched a relentless and very public campaign to regain the presidency of the Teamsters, a move that sent shockwaves through the underworld. For Bufalino and the Commission, a resurgent Hoffa was a catastrophe in the making. He was no longer a reliable partner. He was a loose cannon, a man with intimate knowledge of their deepest financial secrets who was now openly threatening to tear down the entire corrupt edifice they had spent 2 decades building. He was talking, and in their world, talking was a capital offense. The man who had been the key to the kingdom was now the single greatest threat to its survival. The whispers began, the quiet conversations in social clubs and corner tables, the measured discussions about a problem that needed a permanent solution. The man who had once been Jimmy Hoffa's closest and most trusted friend in the underworld, the quiet Don from Pennsylvania, was now being called upon to preside over his fate, a decision that would lead to a hot summer day in 1975, a restaurant parking lot in Detroit, and a mystery that would forever haunt the American imagination, cementing the name of Russell Bufalino in the annals of infamy not for the power he wielded in life, but for the one secret he would carry to his grave. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa on July 30th, 1975, is the black hole at the center of Russell Bufalino's story, an event of such profound and enduring mystery that it has eclipsed nearly everything else about the man, transforming him in the public imagination from a powerful crime boss into a spectral figure lurking at the heart of America's most famous unsolved crime. The official facts are simple and stark, a clinical framework upon which decades of speculation have been built. Hoffa left his home in Lake Orion, Michigan, around 1 p.m., telling his wife he was heading to a meeting with 2 men, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a Detroit mob captain, and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, a powerful and notoriously violent Teamster official from New Jersey with whom Hoffa had a long and bitter feud. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. at the Marchus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a suburb of Detroit. Hoffa was seen in the restaurant's parking lot, growing increasingly impatient. He made a phone call from a payphone, reportedly telling an associate that the men he was supposed to meet had not shown up. Witnesses later reported seeing him get into a maroon-colored car, believed to be a 1975 Mercury Marquis, with 2 or 3 other men. He was never seen or heard from again. His disappearance triggered the largest FBI investigation since the Lineburg kidnapping, involving thousands of agents, countless leads, and dozens of theories. But no body, no crime scene, and no definitive answers were ever found. While the public spectacle unfolded, with police dredging lakes and digging up fields, the focus of the investigation quickly turned to the man who had been Hoffa's closest mob ally, the man who had the most to lose from his attempted comeback, and the man who possessed the authority and the cold-blooded disposition to order such an audacious act, Russell Bufalino. He was in the Detroit area on that very day, a fact confirmed by the FBI, staying at the Southfield Sun Valley Motel with his wife and several associates, including his longtime driver, Edward the Bicycle Rider Ciandra, and the powerful Buffalo crime boss, Stefano Magaddino. His presence was not a coincidence. It was, in the parlance of his world, a command performance. The decision to eliminate Hoffa would not have been made lightly or unilaterally. It would have required the approval of the Commission, and Bufalino, as Hoffa's original sponsor and the man with the most to lose, would have been central to that deliberation. He was there to oversee, to lend the weight of his authority to the operation, and to ensure that a messy, complicated problem was cleaned up with the efficiency and silence that had always been his trademark. The actual mechanics of the disappearance, pieced together from FBI files, informant testimonies, and the later confessions of those involved, point to a meticulously planned abduction. Hoffa was likely lured to the restaurant under the pretense of a reconciliation meeting, a ruse he would have found plausible. The maroon car was probably driven by a trusted Bufalino associate, perhaps even his own driver. Hoffa, expecting to see Giacalone and Provenzano, would have gotten into the car without a struggle, only to find himself in a trap from which there was no escape. He was almost certainly murdered almost immediately, his body then disposed of in a manner that has withstood all attempts at discovery. The most credible theories, supported by the account of Frank Sheeran, a Philadelphia hitman and Hoffa's own friend who claimed Bufalino directly ordered him to carry out the hit, suggest the body was cremated, perhaps in a massive incinerator at a New Jersey funeral home with mob connections, or compacted into scrap metal, vanishing as completely as a whisper in a storm. For Bufalino, the aftermath was a masterclass in damage control. He was interviewed by the FBI, of course, but he offered nothing. He expressed no concern, no surprise, no knowledge. He was the Sphinx, his calm demeanor and professed ignorance a formidable wall against the onslaught of questions. The FBI knew he was involved, they knew he was the architect, but they could prove nothing. There were no witnesses willing to talk, no forensic evidence, no paper trail. The Hoffa case became a monument to the power of omerta and the effectiveness of Bufalino's lifelong strategy of silence. He had eliminated the single greatest threat to his empire and, in doing so, had demonstrated the ultimate reach of his power. He had killed the most famous labor leader in America in broad daylight and simply walked away, returning to his life in Pennsylvania as if nothing had happened. The Hoffa disappearance was not just a murder. It was a message, a chilling reminder to anyone who might consider crossing the mob that there were no limits, no boundaries, and no one was beyond their reach. It was the peak of Bufalino's operational prowess, but it was also the beginning of his end. The intense, unrelenting spotlight that followed, the constant pressure from federal investigators, and the slow, inevitable erosion of his world through the emergence of a new, terrifying weapon in the government's arsenal. The Witness Protection Program and the RICO statute would soon conspire to bring the long, quiet reign of the Invisible Emperor to a final, and very public, conclusion. The aftermath of Jimmy Hoffa's vanishing act cast an unyielding and unforgiving light upon Russell Bufalino, a glare from which even his profound mastery of the shadows could not fully shield him. 4 decades, he had operated on the principle that visibility was vulnerability, but now his name was inextricably linked to the most sensational crime of the era, making him a permanent fixture on the whiteboards of every federal agent from Detroit to Washington. The sheer audacity of the Hoffa disappearance, its brazenness and its clean execution, transformed the public and governmental perception of organized crime. It was no longer a local nuisance of corrupt cops and neighborhood bookies, but a sophisticated, national conspiracy capable of making a national figure disappear without a trace. This new reality galvanized law enforcement in a way that the Apalachin debacle had not, leading to the refinement and aggressive application of the most powerful legal weapon ever devised against the Mafia, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. This statute, passed in 1970 but now being wielded with newfound vigor and purpose, allowed prosecutors to target the entire structure of a criminal enterprise, connecting the bosses who gave the orders to the soldiers who carried them out, and sentencing them to decades in prison for the pattern of their crimes, even if direct proof of a specific murder was elusive. For an octogenarian don like Bufalino, whose life's work was the very definition of a criminal enterprise, RICO was an existential threat. The walls, so carefully constructed over a lifetime, began to show their first cracks not from a frontal assault, but from the internal corrosion of fear and self-preservation. The old codes were breaking down. The government's witness security program offered a terrifyingly effective alternative to omerta. A man facing a lifetime in prison could now break his oath of silence, testify against his bosses, and be reborn with a new identity in a new town, a prospect that proved irresistible to a growing number of disillusioned and frightened mobsters. Bufalino, now in his late 70s and early 80s, found himself navigating a landscape that was fundamentally alien to the one he had helped create. The trusted relationships, the lifelong loyalties, the patient building of consensus, all of it was being rendered obsolete by the cold calculus of federal sentencing guidelines. His legal troubles, which had once been minor inconveniences easily brushed aside with a good lawyer and a silent witness list, began to mount with a grim and relentless momentum. The first major blow fell not from the Hoffa investigation directly, but from a case that epitomized the kind of mundane, brutal enforcement that was the bedrock of his power. In 1977, he was indicted for his role in the murder of a Pennsylvania coal miner named John Gotti, who had been killed, along with his wife and daughter, in 1969 after mounting a reform campaign against the corrupt president of the United Mine Workers, W. Tony Boyle. The murder, carried out by hired gunmen, was orchestrated to maintain the mob's influence over the union's massive treasury, a scheme straight out of the Bufalino playbook. While Bufalino was ultimately acquitted of these charges after a complex trial, the very fact that he was in the courtroom, his name spoken in open testimony, was a sign that his immunity was fading. The pressure was unrelenting. In 1980, he was convicted on federal obstruction of justice charges for attempting to influence a witness in a separate case, a stark demonstration that the government was now successfully picking apart the edges of his empire, charging him not with the master crimes of murder and racketeering, but with the process crimes, the lies, the intimidations, the cover-ups that were necessary to maintain it. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, a sentence that, for a man of his age, was a profound and humiliating defeat. The image of the quiet Don, the invisible emperor, being fingerprinted and led away in handcuffs was a powerful symbol of a changing era. Even from his prison cell, however, he attempted to rule, issuing orders and maintaining his authority, but the world outside was moving on. New, more ruthless factions were rising, and the old respect for his generation was dying. Upon his release, he was a shadow of his former self, an old man diminished by age and the relentless grind of the legal system. But the government was not finished with him. The final, definitive case against Russell Bufalino was built not on a single dramatic crime, but on the accumulated weight of his entire life's work, a RICO indictment that sought to finally hold him accountable for the pattern of corruption, violence, and intimidation that had defined his 6-decade-long reign. The trial was a monumental affair, a procession of former associates, now turned government witnesses, taking the stand to detail the inner workings of his organization, from the control of the garment industry to the manipulation of the Teamsters. They spoke of his calm authority, his decisive orders, his role as the final arbiter of disputes and the architect of grand schemes. The man who had spent a lifetime avoiding the spoken word now found his legacy being defined by the words of others, men who had broken the sacred code to save themselves. In 1982, at the age of 79, Russell Bufalino was convicted under the RICO statute and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was not a sentence for the murder of Jimmy Hoffa or for the plots against Castro, but for the very existence of the criminal enterprise he had built. It was a legal acknowledgement of the power he had wielded, a power so pervasive that its mere exercise was now a felony. This conviction was the true end of his story, the final, irreversible confirmation that the world he had mastered was gone, replaced by one where the rules of the game had changed in ways he could no longer control. He would serve only a fraction of his sentence, his health rapidly declining, but he would die a convicted felon, a final, stark notation on the ledger of a man who had, for so long, believed himself to be above any law. The final years of Russell Bufalino's life were a protracted and deliberate fade to black, a quiet coda to existence that had been defined by its forceful, if hidden, impact on the world. His release from prison on compassionate grounds in 1989, due to his rapidly deteriorating health, was not a victory but a strategic retreat into the final, impenetrable sanctuary of silence and infirmity. The man who had once moved presidents of unions and whispered with directors of clandestine services was now confined to a wheelchair, his body failing him, his world shrunk to the dimensions of a nursing homeroom in Kingston, Pennsylvania. This was not the dramatic, bloody end met by so many of his contemporaries. No ambush in a smoky social club, no hail of bullets at a toll booth, no lonely demise on a restaurant floor. His end was bureaucratic, medical, and utterly mundane, a final masterstroke of anonymity. In these last years, the federal government, which had finally succeeded in convicting him, maintained a vigilant, if somewhat resigned, watch. They knew that even in his diminished state, the old man still held the keys to vaults of secrets that could have solved countless cold cases and rewritten official histories. But the pressure, the surveillance, the occasional attempt to flip a visitor or a caregiver, all of it was futile. Bufalino's mind, though housed in a failing body, remained a fortress, its gates sealed forever by a code that was as much a part of him as his own DNA. He would offer no deathbed confession, no last-minute act of contrition or vanity. The whereabouts of Jimmy Hoffa, the precise details of the Castro plots, the full extent of the skimming operations in Las Vegas, the names of every corrupted official and judge, all of it remained locked within him, a treasure trove of historical truth that would be rendered permanently inaccessible upon his death. This was his final, and perhaps most powerful, act of control. He determined the limits of what the world would ever know. His death on February 25, 1994, at the age of 90, from natural causes and respiratory failure, was noted in the press, but it did not carry the weight of a national event. The obituaries were obliged to lead with the Hoffa connection, but they struggled to convey the full scope of the man, precisely because so much of it was, and would remain, conjecture. He was buried in the Denison Cemetery in Swoyersville, Pennsylvania, his grave as unassuming as the offices from which he had once ruled. His funeral was a quiet affair, attended by family and a handful of old, tight-lipped associates, a stark contrast to the garish, media circus funerals of a Gotti or a Gallo. There were no long motorcades of limousines, no floral arrangements in the shape of Cadillacs, no eulogies that spoke of his power in anything but the most oblique terms. It was the funeral of a retired tailor, not a mafia don, and in that, it was the ultimate fulfillment of his life's philosophy. In the aftermath of his passing, the empire he had built did not so much collapse as it atomized and dissipated. The world had changed too much. The RICO statute and the witness protection program had broken the back of the traditional Cosa Nostra families. The disciplined hierarchies and codes of honor, which Bufalino had exemplified, gave way to more decentralized, more opportunistic, and often more brutal criminal enterprises dealing in drugs and street-level violence. The Bufalino crime family, so much a product of his unique personal authority and his web of deep relationships, could not survive him. It fragmented, its remnants absorbed by other groups or simply fading into the background noise of American crime. His legacy, therefore, is a paradoxical one. On one hand, he was a failure. He was ultimately convicted, his organization dismantled, his life's work nullified by the very system he had spent 7 decades subverting. Yet, on a deeper level, he succeeded in ways that few of his peers ever could. He achieved a degree of power and influence that extended into the boardrooms of Las Vegas, the halls of Congress, and the briefing rooms of the CIA. He died an old man in his own bed, not a young one in a pool of his own blood. And he took his most vital secrets with him, ensuring his own version of history, a version where he was always in control, always the calmest man in the room, always the master of his own fate, would be the only one that could ever be fully told. The questions he left behind continue to resonate, not as mere curiosities, but as fundamental challenges to our understanding of American power. They force us to ask who truly shapes our history, and to acknowledge that sometimes, the most significant figures are not the ones on the stage, but the ones who patiently, quietly, and relentlessly control the machinery behind the curtains. Russell Bufalino's story is a cautionary chronicle of that hidden machinery, a reminder that influence, when exercised with enough patience and silence, can become a form of true, and terrifying, invisibility. To truly grasp the enduring enigma of Russell Bufalino, one must look beyond the specific crimes and the infamous associations and instead examine the philosophical underpinnings of his power, the very methodology that allowed a man of such modest public profile to cast such a long and dark shadow across the American century. His was a strategy of strategic depth and profound patience, a chess master's approach in a world often dominated by men playing checkers. Where others sought immediate gratification and the flashy rewards of notoriety, Bufalino invested in the long-term assets of relationships, information, and positional advantage. His empire was not a monolithic structure of command and control, but a sprawling, decentralized network of obligated men, a web of mutual self-interest where his role was that of the central, indispensable node. He understood that power was not merely the ability to issue an order, but the capacity to make an offer that could not be refused, or to extend a favor that would one day demand repayment. This system of perpetual obligation was his true currency, and he was its master banker. He cultivated relationships not for a week or a year, but for decades, nurturing them with a gardener's care, understanding that the most valuable alliances are those that have been tested by time and fortified by shared secrets. This is how he maintained his influence over the volatile Jimmy Hoffa long after the initial utility of their partnership had been realized. It was a bond woven from countless transactions, whispered assurances, and a deep, unspoken understanding of the consequences of betrayal. This same principle applied to his relationships with other crime families. He was not a warlord seeking to expand his territory, but a diplomat and an arbiter, a man who could be trusted to resolve a dispute between New York's 5 families with a fairness that, while brutal, was widely perceived as just. His power was, in a sense, borrowed from the power of others, and he was a genius at leveraging it. By positioning himself as the key link between the East Coast's major families, the Teamsters' financial might, and even elements of the intelligence community, he made himself functionally irreplaceable. To move against Bufalino was not simply to move against one man from Pennsylvania. It was to risk destabilizing a vast, interlocking system of financial and criminal arrangements that benefited a wide array of powerful interests. This network provided him with a form of defensive insulation that was far more effective than any army of bodyguards. Furthermore, his operational security was absolute, a product of both his innate disposition and his rigorous discipline. He committed nothing to paper, believing that words on a page were potential witnesses for the prosecution. His conversations were exercises in implication and inference, a language of nods, silences, and carefully chosen pronouns. He conducted his most sensitive business not over the telephone, which he knew was vulnerable, but in person, during long, aimless-seeming walks or in moving automobiles, a practice that made electronic surveillance exceptionally difficult for the authorities. He lived a life of deliberate, unremarkable consistency, his daily routines offering no patterns that could be exploited, his public persona that of a retired businessman, a devoted husband, a parishioner at his local church. This was not a disguise. It was an integrated aspect of his character. He did not see himself as a villain from a gangster movie, and therefore he never felt the need to play the part. This lack of theatricality was his greatest camouflage, allowing him to operate in plain sight while remaining virtually invisible to the casual observer, and often, to the initial focus of law enforcement. His criminal enterprises were themselves designed for stealth and deniability. The control of labor unions, for instance, was a form of power that was administrative and financial, rather than overtly violent. It allowed him to extract wealth through complex, paper-based schemes, kickbacks, phantom employees, sweetheart contracts, that were difficult to trace and even harder to prove in a court of law. The violence was always there, of course, the dark foundation upon which everything was built, but it was a last resort, a tool to be used with surgical precision, not a weapon to be brandished. This restrained, almost corporate approach to crime was decades ahead of its time, a precursor to the modern, globalized criminal networks that prioritize financial manipulation over street-level brutality. In the end, the story of Russell Bufalino forces a redefinition of what we consider power to be. It challenges the Hollywood narrative of the gangster as a loud, impulsive, and ultimately self-destructive figure. Bufalino's life argues that the most formidable and resilient form of power is often the quietest, the most patient, and the most deeply embedded within the legitimate structures of society. He was not an outsider trying to break in. He was a parasite who had learned to live symbiotically within the host, drawing its strength while weakening it from within. His legacy is not a list of crimes, but a chilling blueprint for how influence can be accumulated and wielded from the shadows. A reminder that the most dangerous men are not the ones who inspire fear, but the ones who ensure that their name is never spoken at all. The stark and unsettling contrast between the private reality of Russell Bufalino's power and the public perception of his life forms the core of his enduring mystique, a duality he cultivated with the skill of a master illusionist. To the outside world, to the neighbors on his quiet street in Kingston, Pennsylvania, he was simply Russ, an elderly, well-dressed gentleman of Italian descent, a devoted husband to his wife Carolyn. a man who attended mass regularly and whose life appeared to be a model of quiet retirement after a successful, if vaguely defined, business career. There was no ostentatious display of wealth, no fleet of luxury cars, no sprawling, gaudy mansion that screamed of ill-gotten gains. His home was comfortable but modest, his lifestyle understated, his public interactions polite and reserved. This carefully constructed facade of normalcy was not merely a defensive tactic against law enforcement. It was a fundamental expression of his worldview. He understood that the flamboyant gangster, by the very nature of his notoriety, placed an expiration date on his own freedom and power. The attention was a currency they spent lavishly. For Bufalino, it was a resource to be hoarded and protected at all costs. This commitment to anonymity extended to his inner circle, where he demanded the same discipline from his associates. The Bufalino family was not a large, sprawling organization with hundreds of made men. It was a compact, tightly knit crew of trusted individuals, many bound by blood or decades of shared experience. This small size minimized internal dissent and the risk of leaks, creating a seal of silence that was far more effective than the more porous structures of the New York families. Within this circle, his authority was absolute but never shouted. He ruled through a quiet word, a subtle suggestion, a knowing glance. His commands were not dramatic pronouncements but simple, direct statements of what needed to be done, delivered with a calm assurance that made them all the more compelling. There was no need for ranting or threats. His associates knew the man, they knew his history, and they understood the unspoken consequences of failure or disloyalty. This created an aura of quiet dread that was more potent than any tantrum. One did not disappoint Russell Bufalino because the very idea was unthinkable, a transgression against the natural order of his world. Yet, to view him as a purely cold and calculating machine would be to miss a crucial dimension of his character. By all accounts, he was capable of genuine warmth and loyalty to those within his orbit. He provided for the families of imprisoned associates, he settled disputes with a perceived sense of fairness, and he honored his personal bonds with an unwavering commitment. This dichotomy is essential to understanding how he maintained such fierce loyalty for so long. He was not a distant, feared tyrant, but a paternal, if terrifying, figure who rewarded service and punished betrayal within a clear, if brutal, moral framework of his own design. This complex interplay of personal loyalty and ruthless enforcement is what made his organization so resilient. It was held together not just by fear, but by a twisted form of respect and a shared identity. They were not just employees of a criminal enterprise, they were part of the Bufalino family, a chosen tribe operating in a hostile world. This inner world, however, was increasingly besieged by the changing tides of the late 20th century. The rise of electronic surveillance, the advent of the RICO statute, and the corrosive effect of the Witness Protection Program began to erode the foundations of his authority. The old ways, built on face-to-face conversations and unshakable codes of honor, were becoming obsolete. Younger generations of criminals, often fueled by the immense profits of the drug trade, lacked the patience and discipline of the old guard. They were quicker to violence, more prone to flashy displays of wealth, and more willing to break the ancient codes to save themselves. Bufalino, in his final years, witnessed the slow decay of the world he had mastered, a world where man's word was his bond and silence was a sacrament. He saw his own conviction as not just a personal failure, but as a symptom of this larger cultural collapse within the underworld. The government, through its new legal tools and its ability to turn trusted associates into informants, had finally found a way to breach the walls of his carefully constructed fortress. The very patience that had been his greatest strength now worked against him, as federal investigators, armed with the long timeline allowed by RICO, could patiently stitch together a case from decades of small, interconnected crimes. The man who had always played the long game finally found himself outlasted by a system that had learned to be even more patient, and even more relentless, than he was. His story, therefore, is not just the rise and fall of a single crime boss, but the story of a specific era in American criminal history. An era defined by certain rules, certain loyalties, and a certain way of doing business, and its eventual, inevitable demise under the weight of a modernizing society and a determined legal opposition. Russell Bufalino was the perfect embodiment of that era, its most successful and refined product, and his ultimate defeat signaled its definitive end. The legal reckoning that finally ensnared Russell Bufalino was not a single, dramatic courtroom battle over a specific murder, but a slow, methodical, and cumulative process that mirrored his own patient accumulation of power, a grinding down of his defenses through the relentless application of a new legal paradigm that viewed his entire life's work as a single, continuous crime. The RICO statute was the perfect, almost poetic, counter to his methodology. Where he had built a network, RICO targeted the network itself. Where he had operated through compartmentalization and secrecy, RICO allowed prosecutors to connect dots across decades and jurisdictions, presenting a mosaic of criminality where no single tile told the whole story. But the complete picture was undeniable. His 1982 trial was not merely about convicting an old man, it was a judicial exhumation of his entire empire, a public autopsy on a career spent in the shadows. The courtroom became a stage for a parade of ghosts from his past, former associates, lower-level functionaries, and even one-time allies who, faced with the terrifying prospect of dying in prison, chose to break the oath of omerta and testify for the government. These were not outsiders making accusations. These were men who had been in the room, who had carried the messages, and who had followed the orders. They spoke of the hidden control over garment industry trucking, detailing how Bufalino's influence ensured that certain companies got the lucrative contracts while others mysteriously found their trucks vandalized or their drivers intimidated. They provided a roadmap to the systematic looting of the Teamsters pension fund, explaining how loans were approved not on their financial merit, but on the size of the hidden kickback that would flow back to the Bufalino organization. They testified about the structure of his criminal family, his role as the final arbiter of disputes, and his calm, unchallenged authority over a vast swath of the northeastern underworld. For the prosecutors, the strategy was not to prove that Bufalino had personally pulled a trigger or driven a truck. It was to prove that he was the CEO of a criminal corporation, and that the myriad acts of extortion, fraud, and violence committed by his subordinates were all in service of that corporation's goals, and thus were his responsibility. The defense, of course, painted a different picture, attempting to portray the government's witnesses as desperate liars and convicted felons who were trading fabricated stories for reduced sentences, and Bufalino himself as a respected, retired businessman being persecuted for his associations. They leaned into his public persona, the elderly, frail man sitting quietly at the defense table, a picture of misunderstood dignity. But the weight of the evidence, the sheer volume of corroborated testimony from multiple sources, was overwhelming. The jury was presented with a choice: believe that a staggering number of unrelated individuals from different walks of life had all coincidentally conspired to frame an innocent old man, or believe that the quiet, unassuming figure before them was, in fact, the architect of a sophisticated and far-reaching criminal conspiracy. They chose the latter. The guilty verdict on racketeering charges was a landmark moment, a symbolic end of an era. It demonstrated that the federal government had finally developed the tools and the will to dismantle the highest echelons of organized crime, not by catching them in a single, spectacular act, but by documenting the pattern of their existence. The sentence of 10 years in prison for a man of his age was effectively a life sentence, a judicial acknowledgement that his freedom itself was a threat to the social order. His subsequent incarceration was the final, humiliating inversion of his life's philosophy. The man who had prized his invisibility and autonomy was now a number in a federal prison, his every movement monitored, his every conversation potentially recorded, his life reduced to a sterile routine dictated by a bureaucracy he had spent his entire life evading and corrupting. Even from his cell, attempts were made to maintain some semblance of control, messages relayed through visitors and compliant lawyers, but the power was gone. The network outside was disintegrating, its members dead, imprisoned, or turned informant. The world was moving on, and the legend of the Quiet Don was being replaced by the cold, hard fact of federal inmate number 12345. This final chapter was not marked by a dramatic last stand or a defiant proclamation, but by the slow, steady dimming of a formidable will, a forced retirement imposed not by time, but by the immutable judgment of the law. His release to a nursing home in 1989 was an act of mercy grounded not in forgiveness, but in the clinical recognition that the body housing this formidable criminal mind had been defeated by the mundane forces of age and illness, rendering him physically incapable of posing any further threat. The system had not killed him, but it had successfully contained him, studied him, and ultimately, neutralized him, proving that even the most patient and invisible of enemies could be outlasted by a society finally determined to defend itself. The physical and mental decline of Russell Bufalino in his final years presented a profound paradox, a stark contrast between the formidable legend and the frail reality. Confined to a nursing home in Kingston, Pennsylvania, the man who had once whispered orders that reshaped industries and altered destinies was now dependent on the care of strangers, his world shrunk to the four walls of a sterile room. This was not the quiet retirement of a beloved community elder. It was the supervised seclusion of a vanquished king, his kingdom dissolved, his court dispersed. The very anonymity he had cultivated so expertly now worked against him in this new context, reducing his immense notoriety to a mere footnote in a medical chart. To the nurses and aides who tended to him, he was likely just another nonagenarian patient, requiring assistance with the most basic human functions, a figure of pity rather than fear. Yet, even in this diminished state, the habits of a lifetime remained. The silence that had been a strategic weapon became the natural state of a fading mind. The watchful eyes that had once missed no detail now often gazed into a middle distance, their focus turned inward. It is tempting to wonder what thoughts occupied him during those long, quiet hours. Did he replay the countless strategic decisions, the whispered alliances, the precise applications of pressure and persuasion that had built his empire? Did he dwell on the faces of those he had ordered eliminated, from rival gangsters to the inconvenient union reformer? Or did his mind linger on the one name that would forever be linked with his, the spectre of Jimmy Hoffa, whose disappearance had triggered the unrelenting scrutiny that ultimately led to his downfall? We can never know, for the man who had spent a lifetime guarding his secrets took them with him to the very end, his internal world remaining as impenetrable in decline as it had been at the height of his power. The federal authorities, though their primary objective had been achieved with his conviction, maintained a peripheral interest, knowing that this frail body still housed the answers to some of the nation's most enduring criminal mysteries. But any hope of a deathbed confession, a final act of historical clarity, was futile. Bufalino's identity was so entirely fused with the code of silence that breaking it, even at the very threshold of death, would have been an unthinkable negation of his entire being. His passing on February 25, 1994, was thus an anticlimax of the highest order. There was no violent end, no last dramatic stand, only the slow, quiet surrender of a body that had simply worn out. The official cause was respiratory failure, a mundane and clinical conclusion for a life that had been anything but. His funeral, as requested and as befitted his lifelong philosophy, was a small, private affair, a stark contrast to the lavish, media-saturated send-offs for other mob bosses. It was the final, perfect performance of the unassuming gentleman from Pittston, a character he had played so convincingly for 9 decades. In death, as in life, he managed to control the narrative, ensuring that his exit from the world stage would be as quiet and unremarkable as his preferred method of operating within it. The legacy he left behind is complex and deeply ambiguous. On one hand, he stands as a cautionary tale, proof that the long arm of the law, though sometimes slow to act, can eventually reach even the most insulated and careful of criminals. His conviction under RICO was a watershed moment, a blueprint for how to dismantle such sophisticated criminal enterprises. Yet, on the other hand, his life is a chilling testament to the terrifying efficiency of patient, quiet power. He demonstrated that it was possible to operate a vast criminal consortium for the better part of a century, corrupting unions, manipulating markets, and allegedly conspiring with intelligence agencies, all while maintaining the public facade of a simple, law-abiding citizen. The questions he took to his grave are not merely the stuff of true crime fascination, they are unresolved threads in the tapestry of American history. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the permeability of the institutions we trust, and the unsettling reality that the most significant architects of our national story are not always the ones we elect or celebrate, but sometimes the ones we never truly see. Russell Bufalino's enduring relevance lies not in the crimes he was convicted of, but in the shadow he cast, a long, cold shadow that serves as a permanent reminder of the power of silence, the resilience of corruption, and the elusive nature of truth itself. The shadow that Russell Bufalino cast did not dissipate with his death. Instead, it solidified into a permanent and haunting question mark over the official narrative of American power in the 20th century, forcing a reluctant acknowledgement that the history we think we know is often merely the surface layer of a far more complex and disturbing reality. His life and career stand as an enduring challenge to the simplistic dichotomy of good and evil, of lawful and criminal, revealing instead a landscape of murky allegiances and symbiotic relationships where the guardians of order and the architects of chaos sometimes found their interests alarmingly aligned. The declassification of documents over the years has only deepened the mystery, providing tantalizing glimpses into the abyss without ever illuminating its full depth. We now have official confirmation, through CIA files and the findings of the Church Committee, of the plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, of the meetings between agency intermediaries and mafia figures like Santos Trafficante and Sam Giancana. While Bufalino's name is often more carefully shielded in these records, his presence is felt in the negative space, the connective tissue between the disparate players, the man whose guarantee of discretion made such a blasphemous alliance even conceivable. This documented collusion between the national security state and the underworld fundamentally alters our understanding of the Cold War, suggesting that in its most clandestine theaters, the United States was willing to make a Faustian bargain, enlisting the services of the very criminal empires it was publicly vowed to destroy. For Bufalino, this was the ultimate validation of his power, but it also implicates the system itself in his longevity. How many of his operations, from the movement of illicit goods to the silencing of witnesses, were inadvertently shielded by a government that saw him, however temporarily, as a strategic asset? This is not the stuff of conspiracy theory. It is the documented, if unsettling, record of a nation at war with itself, where the imperatives of anti-communism sometimes trump the principles of justice and the rule of law. Beyond the geopolitical intrigue, Bufalino's legacy is also etched into the economic landscape of modern America. The systematic looting of the Teamsters pension fund that he helped orchestrate had real and devastating consequences for thousands of working men and women whose retirement security was compromised to finance mob-owned casinos and skyscrapers. The corrosive influence he wielded over labor unions left a stain on the entire labor movement, providing ammunition for its enemies and undermining the moral authority of collective bargaining for decades. The garment and trucking industries in the Northeast were distorted by his control, creating an unfair playing field where success was determined not by merit or efficiency, but by one's willingness to pay a hidden tax to the Bufalino organization. This economic legacy is a reminder that organized crime is not a victimless endeavor. Its true cost is borne by the anonymous thousands who pay higher prices, receive lower pensions, or see their honest businesses fail because they refuse to play by the mob's corrupt rules. And then, of course, there is the human toll, the countless lives ended or irrevocably shattered by the violence that underpinned his authority. From the coal miner Jock Yablonsky and his family, murdered to preserve a corrupt Union presidency, to the unknown, unnumbered associates and rivals who were eliminated to enforce discipline or settle scores, the trail of blood that wins its way back to Bufalino's quiet decisions is long and dark. These were not characters in a gangster film. They were fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, their lives extinguished to maintain the stability and profitability of his criminal enterprise. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa remains the most famous of these victims, but it is merely the tip of an iceberg of suffering and loss. To study Bufalino's life is to be forced to confront this brutal arithmetic of power, where human lives were often the cheapest currency in the transaction. His ability to compartmentalize this violence, to order a murder and then sit down to a peaceful family dinner, speaks to a profound detachment, a chilling ability to separate his personal morality from his professional conduct. This, perhaps, is the most frightening aspect of his character, not the capacity for violence, but the calm, administrative efficiency with which he deployed it, as if he was simply managing a portfolio and occasionally needed to prune a bad investment. In the final analysis, Russell Bufalino becomes a Rorschach test for how we view power. We can see him as a singular monster, an anomaly in the American story, and thus contain the threat he represents. Or, we can see him as the ultimate expression of a certain kind of American ambition, ruthless, pragmatic, and relentlessly focused on results, channeled into an illicit arena. He was, in his own way, a perverse embodiment of the American dream, an immigrant who rose from nothing to wield immense influence, but he did so by creating a dark parallel universe where the rules of society were suspended and his will was the only law that truly mattered. His story is a warning that the qualities we often celebrate, ambition, loyalty, strategic thinking, can, when divorced from ethics and the common good, create a monster of terrifying efficiency and resilience. The Quiet Don from Pennsylvania forces us to ask not just who he was, but what his enduring presence in our history says about the nature of power itself, and the fragile institutions that stand between order and the chaos he so masterfully represented. The cultural and historical footprint of Russell Bufalino, while intentionally faint, has been amplified and distorted through the lens of popular media, creating a secondary legacy that exists in the space between the documented facts and the public imagination, a space he would have deeply despised but is now an inescapable part of his story. His portrayal in Martin Scorsese's film The Irishman brought his name and his quiet, ominous presence to a global audience for the first time, with Joe Pesci's masterful performance capturing the essence of his power, the still, watchful eyes, the economy of words, the absolute authority conveyed not through volume but through unshakable calm. This cinematic interpretation, while a work of fiction based on the controversial accounts of Frank Sheeran, succeeded in translating the Bufalino method for a modern viewership, demonstrating how a whisper could be more terrifying than a scream and how a suggestion could carry the weight of a death sentence. Yet, this very portrayal also risks simplifying the man, reducing a life of complex, patient strategy into a series of dramatic moments centered around the Hoffa disappearance. The real Bufalino was not merely a supporting character in the Jimmy Hoffa story. He was the central architect of a vast criminal ecosystem in which the Hoffa saga was merely one, albeit spectacular, chapter. The danger of this pop culture assimilation is that it can obscure the broader, more insidious lessons of his career, the quiet corruption of unions, the strategic manipulation of legitimate industries, and the deeply embedded nature of his power that made him so much more formidable than his flashier counterparts. Beyond the silver screen, his name surfaces in countless true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books, each attempting to peel back another layer of the onion, yet always finding more mystery than revelation. He has become a staple figure in the genre, a symbol of the unsolvable, the man who knew everything but said nothing. This posthumous notoriety is the final irony of his life. The man who cherished anonymity has become an icon of clandestine power, his name whispered with a mixture of fear and fascination by generations who never knew his world. Historians and journalists continue to grapple with his full impact, sifting through newly released FBI files and court transcripts, hoping to find the overlooked clue that might finally connect all the dots. These academic and investigative pursuits have slowly built a more nuanced picture, moving beyond the headline crimes to understand the mechanics of his empire. They analyze his business ledgers, trace the flow of money from the Teamsters pension fund to mob-controlled casinos, and map his network of associates, creating an organizational chart of influence that is a testament to his strategic genius. This scholarly attention confirms what law enforcement long suspected, that Bufalino was a different kind of criminal, a corporate executive of crime whose product was fear and whose bottom line was power. The ongoing fascination with him is driven by more than just a desire to solve the Hoffa case. It is a recognition that his life offers a masterclass in the architecture of influence. In a world increasingly dominated by networks, data, and information warfare, Bufalino's methods feel strangely contemporary. He was a master networker before the term was coined, understanding that value lies not just in what you know, but in who you know and, more importantly, who owes you. His use of intermediaries, his reliance on encrypted communication through face-to-face meetings, and his wariness of electronic surveillance all seem prescient in an age of digital espionage and data privacy concerns. He built a resilient, decentralized organization that could withstand the loss of individual nodes, a model that modern tech startups and illicit organizations alike now emulate. Furthermore, his ability to operate in the spaces between legitimacy and criminality, to blur the lines so effectively that they became meaningless, feels particularly relevant in an era of offshore banking, shell companies, and complex financial instruments that can obscure the movement of illicit wealth. The questions he forces us to ask are more urgent than ever. How do we define power in the 21st century? Is it still about visible, centralized authority, or is it increasingly about the unseen networks that control information, capital, and logistics? Russell Bufalino, the old-world mafia don from the Pennsylvania coal country, in Death, becomes a surprisingly modern figure, a case study in the enduring nature of networked power and the perpetual challenge of holding it accountable. His ghost does not haunt the old social clubs of Pittston, but rather the boardrooms and server farms where the new invisible empires are being built, a reminder that the desire for power without accountability is a constant in the human condition, and that the most successful practitioners of this dark art are often those we never see coming. To truly isolate the core components of Russell Bufalino's power is to dismantle a perfectly engineered machine, each part meticulously crafted and integrated to function with silent, relentless efficiency, and the first and most fundamental component was his profound, almost supernatural, mastery of information. In a world where knowledge was the ultimate currency, Bufalino was its most disciplined and prolific banker. He understood that raw information, a businessman's hidden debt, a union official's secret vice, a politician's unspoken arrangement, was a dormant asset until it was weaponized through timing and context. His network of obligors, informants, and associates functioned as a vast, human intelligence apparatus, feeding him a constant stream of data from the shop floors of garment districts, the loading docks of trucking firms, and the back rooms of union halls. He never seemed to be gathering information aggressively. Rather, It flowed to him as a natural consequence of his position, the way tributaries feed a deep, still lake. He was a repository of secrets, and this gave him an omniscient quality that was far more intimidating than any overt threat. A man facing Bufalino knew that this quiet figure across the table was likely aware of his every weakness, his every transgression, his every unguarded moment. This eliminated the need for bluster. The power was inherent in the silence, in the unspoken understanding that he knew everything. The second critical component was his strategic patience, a virtue almost entirely absent in the criminal underworld, where impulsivity and the need for immediate respect often led to early graves. Bufalino's timeline was geologic. He would plant a seed of influence, a small favor for a junior union official, a strategic introduction for an aspiring businessman, and water it for a decade or more, never forcing its growth, until that seed had grown into a towering tree from which he could harvest fruit for a lifetime. This long-game approach allowed him to recover from setbacks that would have destroyed other men. The Apalachin raid was a public relations disaster, but he simply lowered his profile further and waited for the storm to pass. The constant FBI surveillance was an annoyance, not a crisis. He adapted his methods, refined his communications, and outweighted his pursuers, trusting that their institutional attention span would be shorter than his personal resolve. This patience was married to a third component, an unparalleled genius for leverage. Bufalino rarely used force as a first resort. His primary tool was the creation of mutually assured destruction, a web of obligation where doing his bidding was simply the most logical and least painful course of action for all involved. He would identify what a person valued most, their business, their reputation, their family, and then demonstrate, either subtly or overtly, his capacity to take it away. A business owner would be presented with a choice: accept a partner from Bufalino's organization and enjoy guaranteed labor peace and protection, or face a sudden, inexplicable cascade of strikes, vandalism, and lost shipments. The choice was an illusion, and everyone knew it. This application of leverage was clean, efficient, and deniable. It created a system where his victims often became active participants in their own exploitation, rationalizing their compliance as a necessary business decision. The fourth pillar of his power was his meticulous cultivation of a legitimate facade. Unlike the modern trope of the gangster who longs for recognition, Bufalino genuinely seemed to cherish his unremarkable public identity. He was not playing a role, he was living it. His devout Catholicism, his stable marriage, his modest home, all served as the perfect camouflage, allowing him to move through the world of legitimate society without arousing suspicion. This facade was not a weakness or a contradiction. It was a strategic asset. It provided him with a psychological safe haven, a space where he was not the feared Don, but the respected Mr. Bufalino. It also made him incredibly difficult for authorities to prosecute. How could a jury convict this pious, elderly gentleman of running a massive criminal enterprise based on the word of a convicted drug dealer or a known hitman? The contrast was too jarring, the persona too convincing. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, was his deep, intuitive understanding of systems. He did not just commit crimes, he infiltrated and subverted systems: the labor system, the transportation system, the financial system. He saw that controlling the Teamsters was not about controlling a group of men, but about controlling the flow of goods and capital across the entire country. He understood that influencing a union was not about winning a single election, but about capturing the bureaucratic machinery that governed pensions, contracts, and dispute resolution. This systemic approach made his operations incredibly resilient. You could arrest a hitman, but you couldn't arrest the system of kickbacks he had built into the garment industry. You could convict a corrupt union official, but you couldn't easily dismantle the culture of corruption that Bufalino had institutionalized over decades. He wasn't a predator hunting in the system, he was a parasite that had rewired the host's nervous system to serve his own needs. These 5 components: information control, strategic patience, psychological leverage, a legitimizing facade, and systemic infiltration, combined to create a form of power that was not only devastatingly effective but also uniquely suited to withstand the assaults of traditional law enforcement. It was a power designed for endurance, not for spectacle, and it ensured that long after the more famous gangsters were dead or imprisoned, the quiet Don from Pennsylvania was still in his office, still listening, still waiting, and still, silently, ruling. The inevitable and yet strangely protracted downfall of Russell Bufalino serves as a profound case study in the limits of even the most perfectly constructed criminal philosophy when confronted by a societal immune system that has finally identified the threat and mobilized its full resources to combat it. His decline was not a single event but a cascade of systemic failures, each one chipping away at the foundations of his empire until the entire structure was compromised beyond repair. The initial cracks appeared not from the outside, but from within, as the very human elements of his organization began to succumb to pressures that his code of omerta was never designed to withstand. The Witness Protection Program, formally established in 1970, represented a psychological and tactical revolution in the war on organized crime. It offered a terrifyingly simple and effective alternative to the ancient oath of silence. A new life, a new identity, and freedom from the constant fear of retribution in exchange for testimony. For the first time, a made man facing a lengthy prison sentence had a viable exit strategy, a way to save himself and his family that did not involve stoic acceptance of his fate. This program fundamentally altered the calculus of loyalty. Where once a soldier might have taken a decades-long sentence to protect the boss, knowing his family would be provided for, he now had the option to walk away entirely. This new reality began to rot the bonds of Bufalino's organization from the inside out. The trusted associates, the men he had broken bread with for decades, were suddenly potential government witnesses, their loyalty no longer guaranteed by tradition and fear alone. This internal decay was then exploited with devastating effect by the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO statute, which was the legal embodiment of Bufalino's own systemic approach to crime. Just as he had targeted entire industries, RICO targeted the entire criminal enterprise. Prosecutors no longer needed to prove he had personally committed a specific murder. They only needed to prove that he was the leader of an ongoing criminal conspiracy and that a pattern of racketeering activity, which could include everything from mail fraud and wire fraud to extortion and murder, existed. This allowed them to present his life's work as a single, continuous crime. The 1982 trial was the culmination of this new strategy, a painstakingly assembled mosaic where each witness, each document, each recorded conversation was a single tile. Individually, they might have seemed insignificant, but together, they formed an undeniable picture of a sophisticated criminal corporation with Russell Bufalino as its chief executive. The conviction was a landmark moment because it validated the government's new approach. It proved that a man who had successfully avoided direct culpability for his actions for over half a century could be held accountable for the pattern and practice of his power. His imprisonment was more than just the incarceration of a man. It was the symbolic dismemberment of his network. From a prison cell, his ability to manage his empire, to settle disputes, to dispense favors and punishments, was severely curtailed. The world outside continued to change, and in his absence, the remnants of his organization began to fray, attacked by rivals and eroded by the continued defection of its members. His advanced age compounded this isolation. The criminal underworld of the 1980s was a different place, increasingly dominated by the volatile and immensely profitable drug trade, which attracted a younger, more reckless, and less disciplined generation. These new criminals had little reverence for the old codes and the quiet authority of a man like Bufalino. They saw him as a relic, his methods as outdated as the tailored suits he wore. The respect that had once insulated him was gone, replaced by the impatient ambition of those who saw his empire not as a legacy to be preserved, but as territory to be captured. His final years, spent in a nursing home, were the ultimate testament to his defeat. The government, having finally neutralized the threat, now merely monitored the empty shell. The once formidable intelligence network that had reported to him was now a one-way stream of information flowing from his sickbed to FBI file rooms. The man who had been the central node in a vast web of influence was now a terminal point, a subject of case files soon to be marked closed. His death was the final administrative act in this long process of neutralization. There was no violent power struggle over his territory because the territory itself had largely vanished, dissolved by convictions, defections, and the changing tides of illicit enterprise. The empire of the Quiet Don did not fall in a blaze of glory. It was systematically dismantled, piece by piece, its architect left to watch the demolition from a prison cell and then a nursing home, a king deposed not by a rival, but by the inexorable and patient machinery of a modern state that had finally learned to fight a shadow war on its own terms. The ultimate and most perplexing legacy of Russell Bufalino lies not in the crimes he committed or the empire he built, but in the void he left behind, a vacuum of definitive truth that has perpetuated his influence long after his death, ensuring that his story remains an open file in the annals of American history rather than a closed case. This enduring mystery is the final, masterful triumph of his philosophy of silence. By carrying his most consequential secrets to the grave, he guaranteed that his name would never truly be relegated to the past tense, but would instead remain a subject of intense speculation, investigation, and cultural fascination. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa is the most glaring example of this, a black hole of information that continues to pull in journalists, authors, and amateur sleuths with an almost gravitational force. Every few years, a new theory emerges, a new location is dug up based on a credible tip, or a deathbed confession from a peripheral figure makes headlines, only to fizzle out into inconclusiveness. Each of these cycles resurrects Bufalino's name, re-establishing his role as the central, sphinx-like figure at the heart of the mystery. He remains the man who knew, the one person who could have drawn a map to the truth, and his permanent silence is a constant reminder of the power he wielded. This is not an accident. It is by design. His unwavering commitment to omerta was, in its final effect, a strategic decision to control the historical narrative. He understood that as long as the questions remained, his power would, in a sense, persist. He would continue to be the subject of analysis, his methods studied, his influence debated. This posthumous existence is a form of immortality that a more loquacious gangster could never achieve. Beyond the Hoffa case, his shadow falls across other unresolved questions of the Cold War era. The full extent of the CIA-Mafia plots, the precise number of politicians and judges who were on his payroll, the complete map of the billions of dollars funneled from the Teamsters pension fund into mob projects. These are all historical puzzles for which Bufalino held the final pieces. His death did not solve these mysteries. It rendered them permanently unsolvable, casting a permanent shade of doubt over the official records. This has a corrosive effect on our understanding of history. It forces us to acknowledge that the tidy, documented version of events is often incomplete, that the true levers of power were pulled by men who left no documents, only consequences. Furthermore, Bufalino's legacy is kept alive by the very legal system that defeated him. The precedents set by his prosecution under RICO became the foundational playbook for dismantling every major crime family that followed. Law enforcement agencies and law schools still study the Bufalino case as a textbook example of how to attack a decentralized, network-based criminal enterprise. His methods, born in the social clubs of Pennsylvania, are now taught in academies as a cautionary tale of sophisticated criminality. In a strange twist, the man who avoided the spotlight has become a permanent fixture in the curriculum of justice. His life is a required chapter in the story of American law enforcement's evolution, a case study in the development of the legal tools needed to combat an invisible enemy. This academic and professional immortality ensures that new generations of agents, prosecutors, and analysts are intimately familiar with the name Russell Bufalino, not as a forgotten historical figure, but as a relevant and instructive example. Even in popular culture, his influence is subtly pervasive. While The Irishman is the most direct portrayal, the archetype of the quiet, cerebral, and immensely powerful crime boss who operates from the shadows has become a staple of television and literature. Characters who pull the strings without ever raising their voice, who command fear through a reputation for quiet ruthlessness, are all inheritors of the cultural space that Bufalino defined. He proved that a character did not need to be loud to be terrifying, that a whisper could be more compelling than a scream. This cultural echo ensures that his persona, if not the precise details of his life, continues to resonate with audiences, shaping our collective imagination of what power looks like. In the end, Russell Bufalino achieved a form of victory in his defeat. He was convicted and imprisoned, his empire was broken, but his mystery remained intact. He forced the world to acknowledge that the most dangerous men are not always the ones we see coming, that power can be accumulated in silence and exercised through implication. He transformed himself from a man into a myth, and in doing so, he ensured that his story would never truly be over. The questions he left unanswered are his final, lasting monument, a perpetual challenge to historians, a thorn in the side of the justice system, and a chilling reminder that the full truth of our past is often buried not in the ground, but in the stubborn, unyielding silence of the dead. The human cost of Russell Bufalino's reign, the vast and largely unrecorded tapestry of lives broken, extinguished, or irrevocably altered by his decrees, forms the most somber and essential counterpoint to the clinical analysis of his power structure. a necessary remembrance that behind the strategic genius and the fascinating mythology lies a trail of profound suffering that is his true and most damning legacy. To view his life solely through the lens of his cunning or his influence is to sanitize a history drenched in the blood of the innocent and the complicit alike. Consider the case of Jock Jablonski, the United Mine Workers reformer murdered alongside his wife and daughter on New Year's Eve in 1969, a hit ordered to preserve the mob-controlled presidency of W.A. Tony Boyle. For Bufalino, this was a business transaction, a necessary measure to maintain a lucrative stream of corruption from the Union's treasury. But for the Jablonski family, it was the apocalyptic end of their world, a brutal, home invasion slaughter that extinguished 3 lives in a storm of gunfire, leaving behind a family and a community shattered by a violence they could never have imagined. This was not an abstract exercise in labor racketeering. It was a mother and daughter executed in their beds, a father gunned down for daring to demand honesty. Then there are the countless, nameless victims, the small business owners in the garment district who saw their livelihoods crushed because they refused to pay a tax to a Bufalino-controlled trucking firm, the truck drivers and warehouse workers whose pension funds were systematically looted to build mob-owned casinos, leaving them with a less secure retirement after a lifetime of back-breaking work. The ordinary citizens in communities across the Northeast whose local economies were distorted by his shadowy control, paying higher prices and facing fewer choices because the free market had been supplanted by a criminal monopoly. These people never met Russell Bufalino, they never heard his quiet voice, but they felt the economic violence of his empire in their wallets and in their opportunities, their own American dreams subtly diminished to fuel his own. And of course, there were the soldiers in his own army, the men who carried out his orders and who, when they became liabilities, were ruthlessly discarded. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa is the celebrity case, but it obscures the dozens of other associates and rivals who were clipped, whacked, or taken for a ride on Bufalino's authority. These were men who had, in many cases, given him their loyalty, only to find that loyalty was a one-way street that ended in a shallow grave or a car compacted into a cube of scrap metal. Their families were left with the same unanswered questions, the same gaping absence, the same lifetime of wondering, their grief compounded by the code of silence that forbade them from ever seeking public justice or closure. The psychological toll on those who lived within his orbit was equally devastating. The constant, low-grade fear of saying the wrong thing, of being seen with the wrong person, of inadvertently drawing the attention of the boss, created a culture of paranoia and emotional isolation. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. Even his own wife, Carolyn, lived a life yoked to his secret world, bound by the same code of silence, her public life a performance of normalcy that masked a private reality of unspoken dread and unaskable questions. To what extent was she an accomplice, and to what extent was she another of his victims, a prisoner of the immense fortune and terrifying power her husband had accumulated? This is the human wreckage that lies beneath the cool, analytical facade of the quiet Don. It is a ledger of pain that can never be fully tallied, a monument not to his genius, but to his profound moral emptiness. His ability to compartmentalize this suffering, to order the death of a man like Jablonski and then sit peacefully in church, speaks to a chilling disconnect, a worldview in which human beings were merely assets or liabilities on a balance sheet. This is the ultimate corruption, not of a union or an industry, but of the soul. The fascination with his tactical brilliance must always be tempered by the remembrance of this brutality. The patient accumulation of power loses its romantic sheen when viewed through the lens of the Jablonski family's final moments. The strategic leverage over the Teamsters becomes a sordid tale of stolen futures when you consider the retired truck driver wondering why his pension doesn't stretch as far as it should. Russell Bufalino's story is not a thrilling gangster saga. It is a tragedy of national scale, a demonstration of how the pursuit of absolute power necessitates the absolute devaluation of human life. To forget this, to focus only on the cleverness of his methods, is to become complicit in the final, most insidious crime. The erasure of his victims and the normalization of the profound evil he represented and so efficiently administered from the quiet of his Pennsylvania office. The geographical and cultural landscape of northeastern Pennsylvania itself, the unlikely cradle of Bufalino's empire, serves as a silent but crucial character in his story, a region whose very character, its insularity, its deep-seated immigrant traditions, its history of hard labor and simmering resentment toward distant centers of power, provided the perfect petri dish for his particular strain of criminal enterprise to flourish. This was not the glamorous, anonymous jungle of New York City or the sun-baked, transient playground of Las Vegas. This was a region of tight-knit, often impoverished communities, built on coal mines and textile mills, where everyone knew everyone else's business and where distrust of external authority was bred in the bone. For generations, the people of towns like Pittston, Scranton, and Wilkes-Barre had learned that survival depended on looking out for one's own, on clan loyalty, and on a pragmatic understanding that the official organs of government, whether in Harrisburg or Washington, were often either indifferent to their plight or actively exploitative. This created a cultural soil rich with the nutrients of omerta, where asking too many questions was a sign of disrespect and where handling problems in-house was not just a preference but a deeply ingrained principle. Into this world, the young Sicilian immigrant Russell Bufalino arrived, and he found not a society to be conquered, but one whose values he already shared and whose inherent structures he could masterfully exploit. He did not need to impose a foreign code of silence. He merely had to align himself with an existing one and elevate it to a level of ruthless professionalism. His power base was not a criminal organization imposed upon the community. In many ways, it was an outgrowth of the community's own shadow economy and its methods of conflict resolution. The social clubs where he held court were not sinister lairs, but central hubs of neighborhood life, places where respected men gathered to discuss business, politics, and community affairs. This provided him with unparalleled cover. Who would suspect that the quiet, well-dressed man having an espresso in a storefront club was, at that very moment, approving a $1 million pension fund loan for a Las Vegas casino, or ordering the murder of a rival hundreds of miles away? The very normalcy of his environment was his camouflage. Furthermore, the economic context of the region was critical. As the coal industry began its long decline and the garment mills faced increased competition, the legitimate avenues for wealth and advancement narrowed for many. Bufalino's empire, in a twisted way, offered an alternative economy. It provided jobs, of a sort, as enforcers, drivers, and lookouts. It offered capital, in the form of juice loans to those who couldn't get bank credit. It could guarantee labor peace for a struggling factory owner or ensure a lucrative contract for a friendly business. For those who played by his rules, the Bufalino organization could seem like a parallel system of governance and finance, one that was often more responsive and efficient than the legitimate one. This created a complex dynamic within the community. While many undoubtedly feared him, others may have felt a begrudging respect or even dependency, viewing him not as a predator, but as a powerful, if dangerous, patron. This local entrenchment made him incredibly difficult for outside law enforcement to penetrate. FBI agents from New York or Philadelphia would find themselves in a world of closed mouths and averted gazes, where their badges inspired not cooperation, but a wall of silent suspicion. The community's inherent distrust of outsiders became a defensive barrier for Bufalino. He was not an outsider, he was one of them. He spoke their language, understood their struggles, and honored their traditions. This deep local rootedness was the ballast that allowed his empire to remain stable for so long, even as its operations extended across the continent. It was his anchor in the real world, a constant reminder of his origins and a source of his strength. The story of Russell Bufalino, therefore, cannot be divorced from the story of this specific American place. It is a story that reveals how the particular social and economic conditions of a region can give rise to a particular kind of power. The coal soot that stained the bricks of Pittston, the rhythmic clatter of the looms in the textile mills, the whispered conversations in 100 social clubs, these were not just a backdrop, they were the essential ingredients. They produced a man who was humble in appearance but boundless in ambition, deeply traditional in his personal life but utterly ruthless in his business, a local fixture who thought on a global scale. To understand him, one must understand the world that made him, a world where loyalty was everything and the law was often seen as nothing, a world that, from its quiet, unassuming streets, produced one of the most formidable and enigmatic criminal minds in American history. The intricate and ultimately fatal relationship between Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Hoffa represents a classic tragedy of power, a Shakespearean drama played out in the gritty arenas of union halls and restaurant parking lots, where the very qualities that forged their alliance inevitably sowed the seeds of its destructive and bloody conclusion. Their bond was never one of friendship in any conventional sense, but rather a symbiotic partnership of immense utility, a fusion of Hoffa's very public, institutional power with Bufalino's very private, underworld authority. Hoffa, the pugnacious and brilliant union leader, provided the keys to the kingdom, the Teamsters' massive membership, its political clout, and, most importantly, its billions of dollars in pension funds. Bufalino, the calm and calculating Don, provided the muscle to secure Hoffa's rise. the intimidation to silence his internal rivals, and the sophisticated financial conduits to launder and invest the illicit profits. For years, this partnership was a masterpiece of criminal synergy. Hoffa got the unquestioned dominance over his union he craved, and Bufalino gained access to a nearly limitless source of capital that he used to finance the mob's expansion into Las Vegas and other legitimate fronts. Bufalino served as Hoffa's primary liaison to the Commission, the trusted intermediary who could translate the mob's demands and ensure Hoffa's compliance. He was the steady hand on the tiller, the one man who could, with a quiet word, temper Hoffa's famous temper and impress upon him the consequences of defying the men who had helped put him in power. This dynamic worked perfectly as long as Hoffa remained the grateful and compliant partner. However, Hoffa's ambition and his towering ego were forces even Bufalino could not permanently control. Hoffa began to see himself not as a partner, but as a peer, an equal to the mob bosses who he believed were indebted to him for his cooperation. His conviction in 1964 for jury tampering and pension fraud, a prosecution driven relentlessly by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was a turning point. From Hoffa's perspective, he had taken the fall alone. He felt the mob had not done enough to protect him, that their influence had failed him at the critical moment. The bitterness festered during his years in prison, a resentment that grew into a burning obsession. When President Nixon commuted his sentence in 1971 on the condition he refrained from union activity, Hoffa agreed, but he had no intention of honoring the deal. He emerged from prison a man possessed, his sole goal to reclaim the presidency of the Teamsters from his handpicked successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, who had, in Hoffa's absence, become far more accommodating to the mob's wishes. Hoffa's planned comeback was a five-alarm fire for the entire underworld. Fitzsimmons was a pliable and predictable asset. A resurgent Hoffa was a loose cannon. He was angry, embittered, and worse, he was talkative. He began making public threats, vowing to clean house and take back my union. For Bufalino and the Commission, this was an existential threat. Hoffa knew everything. He knew the details of every sweetheart loan, every kickback, every skimming operation in Las Vegas. He could name names, dates, and amounts. If he were to testify before a grand jury or even just speak recklessly to the press, he could bring down the entire financial apparatus the mob had spent 2 decades building. The man who had been their greatest asset was now their single greatest liability. The decision to eliminate him would not have been taken lightly. It would have been a matter of cold, clinical business, debated and approved by the Commission. And as the man who had brought Hoffa into the fold, who had vouched for him and managed the relationship for so long, the responsibility for resolving the Hoffa problem would have fallen squarely on Russell Bufalino. It was his mess to clean up. The meeting at the Marchus Red Fox restaurant was the set piece of this final act. Hoffa believed he was going to a reconciliation meeting with his old rivals, Anthony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano, a meeting likely brokered by Bufalino himself to lure Hoffa into a false sense of security. It was a trap, designed with a deep understanding of Hoffa's psychology, his pride, his desire to confront his enemies, and his trust in the old ways of settling disputes. His abduction and murder were carried out with the efficiency that was Bufalino's trademark. The fact that no body was ever found, that no one has ever been conclusively convicted for the crime, is the ultimate testament to his operational genius and the enduring power of the silence he commanded. In the end, the relationship proved the oldest of underworld truths. There are no permanent alliances, only permanent interests. Hoffa's interests, his pride, his legacy, his desire to reclaim his throne, had fatally diverged from the interests of the organization. And in Bufalino's world, when an individual threatened the health of the organization, that individual was, by necessity, removed. The quiet Don from Pennsylvania, the man Hoffa had once considered a friend and trusted advisor, was the one who had to preside over his execution, a grim and final duty that underscored the brutal reality of the power they had both pursued so relentlessly. The Hoffa saga is not just a mystery. It is the dark, logical conclusion of Bufalino's entire philosophy, a demonstration that his loyalty was never to a person, but to the silent, patient, and utterly ruthless accumulation of power itself. The weaponization of the Teamsters Union Pension Fund, orchestrated with chilling precision by Russell Bufalino and his associates, stands as one of the most audacious and impactful financial crimes in American history, A sophisticated heist that did not target a single bank vault but instead systematically looted the retirement security of thousands of working men and women to build a criminal empire that stretched from the factories of the Northeast to the glittering casinos of the Las Vegas Strip. This was not a simple act of embezzlement. It was a complex, long-term financial strategy that transformed the Central States, Southeast and Southwest areas pension fund into a multi-billion-dollar piggy bank for organized crime, a source of virtually interest-free capital used to finance ventures that would have been untouchable by traditional lenders. The mechanism was as brilliant as it was corrupt. Through his ironclad influence over Jimmy Hoffa, Bufalino effectively gained control over the fund's board of trustees. Loan applications from legitimate-seeming developers and businessmen would be funneled through mob-controlled intermediaries. The applications themselves were often for risky or speculative projects, the construction of a new casino, the purchase of a failing hotel that no reputable bank would finance. Yet, with a quiet nod from Bufalino's network, the Teamsters fund would approve the loan, often for tens of millions of dollars. The terms were suspiciously favorable, with low interest rates and lenient repayment schedules, but they came with hidden, non-negotiable conditions. A significant portion of the loan, sometimes as much as 20 or 30%, would be immediately kicked back to the mob as a cash point or finder's fee. Furthermore, the mob would demand, and receive, a hidden equity stake in the project or the right to control key contracts, such as the linen service, the food and beverage supply, or the casino's slot machine operation. This allowed them to install their own people and set up elaborate skimming operations before the casino ever opened its doors, siphoning off untaxed, unreported cash directly into the coffers of the crime families. The Stardust, the Fremont, the Desert Inn, and Caesar's Palace, iconic symbols of American entertainment, were all built, in part, with the stolen future of Teamsters members, and were for years controlled through this web of hidden ownership and systematic larceny. The genius of this scheme was its layered deniability. Russell Bufalino never signed a loan document. He never made a phone call to the pension fund directly. His role was that of the ultimate approver, the silent partner whose word was the final guarantee. The flow of money was laundered through a labyrinth of shell corporations, friendly lawyers, and complicit accountants, making it nearly impossible for regulators to trace the path from a truck driver's pension contribution to the counting room of a Las Vegas casino. For the developers, it was a devil's bargain. They gained access to capital that was otherwise unavailable, but they surrendered control of their businesses to shadowy partners who operated outside the law. For the rank-and-file Teamster, the crime was completely invisible. They continued to pay their dues, trusting that their retirement funds were being managed prudently, utterly unaware that their financial security was being used as collateral to build the mob's version of the American dream. The scale of the looting was astronomical. By the late 1970s, the Central States Pension Fund had over $1.4 billion in assets, a staggering sum at the time, and a significant portion of it was tied up in mob-backed loans. The consequences of this systemic theft were devastating and long-lasting. When the scheme was finally exposed through congressional hearings and relentless investigative journalism, the fund was left dangerously underfunded, its portfolio riddled with non-performing loans and toxic assets. This directly led to crises in the pension system, threatening the retirement benefits of countless innocent workers who had played by the rules their entire lives. The government was eventually forced to intervene, placing the fund under federal supervision, a humiliating testament to the depth of the corruption. The looting of the Teamsters pension fund is arguably Bufalino's most lasting and damaging legacy. The murders and the violence were horrific, but they were finite events. The financial crime, however, eroded the very foundation of trust in a critical American institution. It demonstrated that organized crime was no longer just about street-level rackets. It had evolved into a sophisticated financial engine capable of manipulating the levers of high finance on a national scale. It showed that the real power was not in holding a gun, but in holding the purse strings of a multi-billion-dollar trust. For Russell Bufalino, the quiet man from Pennsylvania, this was the pinnacle of his criminal career. He had achieved what Al Capone or John Gotti never could. He hadn't just robbed a bank, he had become the bank, and in doing so, he had woven his criminal organization so deeply into the fabric of the American economy that for decades, it was almost impossible to tell where the legitimate world ended and his illegitimate empire began. This was power in its most insidious and resilient form, a silent partnership with capitalism itself, funded by the stolen futures of the very working class he purported to understand. A profound and unsettling silence that Russell Bufalino maintained until his very last breath, a silence that protected decades of criminal conspiracies and countless accomplices, stands as his most formidable and psychologically complex characteristic, a deliberate and powerful act that was far more than mere adherence to a code. It was the active and continuous shaping of his own legacy and a final, contemptuous defiance of the justice system that sought to define him. This was not a passive state of being quiet. It was an aggressive, weaponized void, a strategic emptiness that he cultivated as assiduously as another man might cultivate a public image. In a world where everyone from low-level soldiers to presidential aides seemed compelled to record their memoirs or give tell-all interviews, Bufalino's refusal to explain himself, to justify his actions, or to seek any form of public understanding or absolution was a radical and disconcerting act. It placed him outside the normal human economy of confession and forgiveness, rendering him an enigma that could be studied but never fully understood. For the FBI and federal prosecutors, this silence was a maddening obstacle. They could build a RICO case on the testimony of others, they could convict him of specific, provable crimes, but they could never get inside his head. They could never hear from the man himself how the empire was built, how the decisions were made, where the bodies were buried, both literally and figuratively. His prison interviews were masterclasses in non-cooperation, offering nothing but polite deflections and feigned ignorance. He was a locked vault, and he had thrown away the only key. This imposed a fundamental limitation on the historical record. We know what Russell Bufalino did through the accounts of others and the paper trail of his crimes, but we can only infer why he did it and what he truly believed. Was he driven by a simple, insatiable greed? Or was it a deeper, more philosophical pursuit of pure, unaccountable power? Did he see himself as a businessman operating in a different arena, or as a predator feeding on the weakness of the system? His silence guarantees that these questions will forever remain in the realm of speculation. This, in turn, has elevated him from a mere criminal to a near mythological figure. The unknown is always more powerful and more frightening than the known. By refusing to provide a narrative, he forced the world to create narratives for him, each one reflecting the fears and fascinations of the storyteller. For some, he is the ultimate pragmatist, a genius of realpolitik. For others, he is a monstrous sociopath, devoid of empathy. His silence acts as a blank screen onto which we project our own understandings of evil and power. Furthermore, this lifelong commitment to silence had a corrosive effect on the very concept of truth. In the absence of his testimony, competing versions of events, about Hoffa, about the CIA plots, about the inner workings of the Commission, have flourished, each with its own proponents and its own supposed evidence. The truth became fragmented, contested, and ultimately, subjective. Bufalino, by saying nothing, made the entire truth of his era permanently debatable. He demonstrated that in the modern age, where information is often mistaken for knowledge, the most powerful statement can be the refusal to provide any information at all. This was his final and most brilliant manipulation of the system. He understood that a society built on transparency, due process, and the search for factual truth is uniquely vulnerable to a man who simply refuses to participate in that search. His silence was a rejection of the entire premise of the justice system, which is based on the idea that through interrogation and evidence, a definitive version of events can be established. Bufalino proved that a single, determined individual could withhold that definitive version, leaving the official record permanently incomplete and haunted by the ghost of what might have been. Even on his deathbed, surrounded by the trappings of his faith, he offered no final confession to a priest that has ever come to light, no last-minute easing of his conscience. He died as he lived, in control of the narrative by refusing to have one. This unyielding silence is his most chilling legacy. It is a reminder that the most dangerous secrets are not those that are difficult to uncover, but those that are willingly, voluntarily, and permanently taken to the grave. In the end, Russell Bufalino's power was not just in the crimes he committed, but in the profound and unbreakable silence that surrounded them, a silence that continues to echo, demanding to be filled with answers that we can never truly have. The inevitable decline of the American Mafia as a cohesive national force, a process that accelerated throughout the 1980s and 1990s, frames the final chapter of Russell Bufalino's life not just as the fall of a single man, but as the passing of an entire era, the end of a specific, code-bound, and patient form of organized crime that he had come to perfectly embody. The world that had nurtured him, a world of social clubs, whispered conversations, and intricate systems of respect and obligation, was being systematically dismantled by forces more powerful than any single rival family. Federal legislation, technological advancement, and a fundamental shift in the cultural and economic landscape of illicit enterprise. The RICO statute was the legal sledgehammer, but it was the witness protection program that shattered the psychological backbone of omerta. For generations, the fear of certain, violent retribution had been enough to guarantee silence. But now, the government offered a terrifyingly effective alternative. Not just safety, but a new life, a clean slate far from the reach of the old bosses. The calculus of loyalty was irrevocably altered. Soldiers who had sworn blood oaths now sat in federal offices, wearing wires and detailing the inner workings of their families in exchange for a chance to see their children grow up. The code that Bufalino had lived by, a code that was as real to him as the law of gravity, was being revealed as a fragile construct, vulnerable to the very human instincts of fear and self-preservation. Simultaneously, the nature of illicit profit was changing. The traditional mob rackets, labor skimming, control of garbage hauling and garment trucking, illegal gambling, were being overshadowed by the astronomical, fast-moving profits of the international drug trade. This new economy favored younger, more ruthless, and less disciplined criminals who operated in loose, fluid networks, not the structured, hierarchical families of Cosa Nostra. These new kingpins had little use for the old rituals, the sit-downs, and the territorial agreements. Their business was global, their loyalties transient, and their violence was often indiscriminate and spectacular. The quiet, patient accumulation of power that Bufalino had mastered was becoming an anachronism in a world of flashy drug lords and violent street gangs. Furthermore, technology became an insurmountable enemy. The electronic surveillance that Bufalino had always feared, the hidden microphones, the wiretaps, the tracking devices, became so sophisticated and pervasive that it made the old methods of communication, the walks in the park and the meetings in moving cars, nearly obsolete. The FBI could now build a case not just on the testimony of a turncoat, but on the boss's own words, captured in damning detail. The digital age was dawning, and it left no room for a man who trusted only face-to-face conversations. Bufalino, in his final years, witnessed the crumbling of his world from a prison cell and then a nursing home. He saw the once great New York families torn apart by indictments and internal betrayals. He saw his own compact, loyal organization rendered impotent, its members dead, imprisoned, or turned informant. The new generation lacked the discipline and the long-term vision that had been his trademark. They were impatient, flashy, and ultimately, far easier for the government to target and convict. The conviction of John Gotti, the Teflon Don, who had courted the media and reveled in his celebrity, was the ultimate contrast to Bufalino's philosophy. Gotti's very public downfall was a spectacle that Bufalino would have found both appalling and predictable. It was the inevitable result of a life lived in the spotlight, a validation of everything he had always believed about the dangers of visibility. His own conviction, while a personal defeat, was somehow more dignified, the result of a long, strategic war, not a reckless, self-inflicted media circus. The death of Russell Bufalino in 1994 can thus be seen as a symbolic endpoint. He was one of the last of his kind, a direct link to the Sicilian-born founders of the American Mafia, a man who remembered the bootlegging days and who had helped build the commission. With him died not just a man, but a particular school of criminal thought, a philosophy of power that emphasized silence, patience, and deep embedding within the legitimate economy. The organized crime that survived him was a different beast, more fragmented, more volatile, and less ideologically coherent. The era of the Quiet Don was over, replaced by an age of noisy, chaotic, and often short-lived criminal enterprises. Russell Bufalino's story, therefore, is the story of the rise and fall of a certain American criminal archetype, a figure whose time had come and, inevitably, gone, a ghost from a receding past who took the full, unvarnished truth of that world with him when he departed. The figure of Russell Bufalino, when placed within the broader context of the classic American gangster narrative, emerges not as a mere participant in that story but as its most sophisticated and successful subversion, a radical departure from the archetype that forces a complete re-evaluation of what it meant to wield true power in the 20th century underworld. The archetypal gangster, as immortalized in film and folklore, is a creature of explosive ID and theatrical violence, a man like Al Capone whose very public reign of terror was designed to inspire a level of awe that bordered on dark celebrity, or like John Gotti, whose flamboyant sartorial style and brazen public defiance of the law were a performance of power meant for a mass audience. These men understood their power in part through its reflection in the public's fearful gaze. Their notoriety was a currency they spent freely, a tool of intimidation that was as important as the violence itself. Bufalino represented the absolute antithesis of this model. His power was not performative, it was operational. It did not seek reflection, it thrived in its own absence. Where Capone used a baseball bat in a banquet hall and Gotti held court on the sidewalks of Little Italy, Bufalino preferred a whispered suggestion in a quiet corner of a social club. His intimidation was not broadcast through headlines, but conveyed through the grim understanding of those who knew the rules of his world. This was a conscious and strategic choice, a philosophy of power that understood that visibility was the precursor to vulnerability, that the spotlight, once turned on, would inevitably attract the attention of law enforcement, rivals, and reformers. He cultivated a persona of profound unremarkability because he understood that in a society obsessed with celebrity and spectacle, the most effective way to operate was to be utterly forgettable. This allowed him to achieve a level of influence that was, in many ways, far greater and certainly more enduring than that of his more famous counterparts. While Capone was brought down on tax evasion charges and Gotti was ultimately undone by the recorded boasts of his own underboss, Bufalino's empire operated with impunity for decades, precisely because it was not an empire that announced itself. His control was not over a city block or a specific neighborhood, but over the vital arteries of national commerce, the flow of goods via the trucking industry, the movement of capital via the pension funds, and the very labor that powered key sectors of the economy. This was power on a structural level, a form of influence that was embedded in the system itself, making it far more resilient and difficult to root out than the territorial control of a street gang. The longevity of his reign is the most compelling evidence for the superiority of his methods. He outlasted countless attorneys general, FBI directors, and presidential administrations. He survived the convulsions of the Apalachin raid, the intense scrutiny following the Hoffa disappearance, and the slow, grinding pressure of federal investigations. His ultimate conviction came not from a single, catastrophic mistake born of arrogance, but from the gradual, cumulative application of a new legal paradigm specifically designed to combat his kind of networked, patient criminality. Even in defeat, his story subverts the gangster myth. There was no dramatic last stand, no final curse hurled at his accusers. His end was quiet, a slow dimming in a nursing home, a final act of understatement that was perfectly consistent with the character he had crafted over a lifetime. In the pantheon of American crime, Russell Bufalino therefore occupies a unique and unsettling space. He is not the tragic, romantic figure of a Scarface, destroyed by his own hubris. He is not the folk hero of a Pretty Boy Floyd, robbing from the rich. He is not the celebrity villain of a John Gotti. He is something far more disquieting, the consummate professional, the master bureaucrat of crime, a man who treated power not as an emotion to be felt, but as a system to be managed. His legacy is a chilling lesson in efficiency, a demonstration that the most effective way to break the rules is not to shout them down, but to learn them so thoroughly that you can rewrite them from the inside, without anyone ever noticing your hand at work. He proves that the most dangerous criminal is not the one who terrifies you on the front page, but the one you never read about at all, the quiet man in the unassuming office who, with a calm demeanor and a few carefully chosen words, could set in motion events that would topple unions, finance empires, and make men vanish from the face of the earth. The enduring and perhaps most unsettling question that Russell Bufalino's life poses to us today is not about the specifics of his crimes, but about the very nature of the system that allowed him to flourish for so long, forcing an uncomfortable examination of the permeability between the criminal underworld and the highest echelons of legitimate power, and challenging the comforting myth that these two worlds are entirely separate and antagonistic. Bufalino's career stands as a stark testament to the fact that organized crime does not operate in a vacuum. It is a parasite that requires a host, and the most successful parasites are those that can integrate so seamlessly that the host's immune system fails to recognize them as a threat. His empire was not built in opposition to American capitalism and governance, but by exploiting its inherent weaknesses and leveraging its core components. He understood that the real power lay not in confronting the system, but in co-opting it. The labor unions, intended to be a counterbalance to corporate power, became, under his influence, a tool for extortion and a source of illicit capital. The pension fund, a symbol of collective worker security, was transformed into a predatory investment bank for the mob. The political machines, built on patronage and backroom deals, were vulnerable to the same tactics of favor trading and intimidation that he employed in his own world. Even the national security apparatus, in its desperation to combat communism, proved willing to sit down at the same table with him, blurring the lines between patriot and criminal in a way that would have been unthinkable in public discourse. This deep integration suggests that Bufalino was not an alien force attacking America from the outside. He was a dark and malevolent outgrowth of certain American impulses, unchecked ambition, the veneration of wealth, the corruptibility of power, and a pragmatic, often cynical, approach to problem-solving that prioritized results over principles. His ability to operate for decades points to a systemic failure, a blindness, or even a complicity within the very institutions designed to prevent such a rise. How many local law enforcement officials looked the other way, either out of fear, corruption, or a misguided sense that he was merely a local businessman keeping a rougher element in check? How many politicians, at various levels of government, accepted his support or his money, turning a blind eye to its source in exchange for votes or favors? How many corporate executives, desperate for labor peace or access to capital, willingly entered into agreements with his intermediaries, choosing profitability over probity? Bufalino's story forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that his power was, in part, a reflection of our own societal compromises. He held up a mirror to the American establishment, and the reflection was not a monster, but a collaborator. This is why his legacy is so much more disturbing than that of a simply violent thug. He demonstrates that the most resilient criminal enterprises are those that become functionally indistinguishable from legitimate enterprise, that the most dangerous corruption is not the one that breaks the law, but the one that subtly rewrites it to serve its own purposes. The fight against him was not a simple cops and robbers drama. It was a protracted, complex war against a shadowy entity that had woven itself into the nation's economic and political fabric. His eventual defeat, while a victory for justice, does not erase the troubling questions his career raised about the integrity of that fabric. It suggests that for every Russell Bufalino who is caught, there may be others who learned his lessons too well, operating with even greater stealth in the increasingly complex and opaque globalized economy of the 21st century, where capital flows instantly across borders and power is often exercised by faceless corporations and anonymous digital networks. In the end, Bufalino's true legacy is this lingering unease, the suspicion that the most significant threats to our society may not come from outside enemies or lone wolves, but from within, from the quiet, patient, and brilliantly opportunistic corruption of the very systems we rely on for our security and prosperity. He is a permanent cautionary tale, a ghost in the machine, reminding us that the price of liberty is not just eternal vigilance against external threats, but an unending, critical scrutiny of the powerful and the seemingly powerless alike, for in the world Russell Bufalino mastered, they were often one and the same. The story of Russell Bufalino, when stripped of its sensationalism and viewed in its entirety, resolves not into a simple morality tale of crime and punishment, but into a profound and enduring meditation on the nature of power itself, its acquisition, its preservation, and its ultimate limitations, a narrative that holds up a dark mirror to the very soul of the American experiment. His life represents a parallel strand of the American dream, one just as potent and, in its own ruthless way, just as successful as any story of legitimate business triumph. He was the immigrant who rose from nothing, the self-made man who built an empire through sheer force of will and intellect, the master of his domain who answered to no one. Yet, he achieved this not through innovation or service, but through the calculated subversion of the system that offered him the opportunity in the first place. He is the dark doppelganger of the captain of industry, a reminder that the same ambition, strategic foresight, and relentless drive that can build a great corporation can also build a vast criminal consortium, and that the line between the two can sometimes be vanishingly thin. His 6-decade-long career serves as a masterclass in a specific, chillingly effective philosophy of power, that true control is exercised not from a throne, but from the shadows, that influence is more durable than terror, that relationships are more valuable currency than cash, and that the most potent weapon is often a secret, patiently kept. He demonstrated that in a noisy, distracted world, the quietest voice in the room can wield the most authority, and that a reputation for silence and reliability can open more doors than a reputation for violence. His downfall, when it finally came, was not the result of a single, character-flawed mistake, as in a Greek tragedy, but the inevitable outcome of a society slowly, painstakingly adapting its defenses against a new kind of threat. The legal and technological innovations that finally ensnared him, RICO, witness protection, electronic surveillance, were the systemic antibodies that eventually learned to recognize and neutralize the pathogen he represented. His conviction was a testament to the resilience of democratic institutions, but the sheer length and scope of his reign beforehand is a sobering testament to how long it can take for those institutions to mobilize effectively against a threat that does not announce itself. In the final accounting, the saga of the Quiet Don leaves us with a series of unresolved tensions that continue to resonate. It is the tension between the public good and private ambition, between the rule of law and the rule of power, between the history we record and the history that remains forever hidden. Russell Bufalino mastered the hidden history, and in doing so, he crafted a legacy of profound ambiguity. He was a man of faith who ordered murders, a devoted husband who presided over a world of brutal infidelity and exploitation, a local fixture who manipulated global events. He was both a creature of his time, a product of a specific immigrant experience and a specific moment in the Cold War, and a timeless figure, whose methods for building and maintaining influence feel as relevant in the age of cybercrime and offshore finance as they did in the smoke-filled social clubs of Pennsylvania. His story cautions us against the seduction of simple narratives. He was not a monster from a foreign land, but a man who emerged from the heart of the American experience, leveraging its opportunities and exploiting its weaknesses with unparalleled skill. He forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about where power truly resides in our society and in what forms it can manifest. The loud, charismatic leader is easy to identify. The quiet, patient, network-based power of a Russell Bufalino is far more difficult to discern, and therefore, far more dangerous. His life is a permanent reminder that while the flamboyant gangster may capture the headlines, it is the quiet man in the background, the one who never raises his voice, who never seeks credit, who operates through a web of unbreakable loyalties and unspoken threats, who often holds the real keys to the kingdom. And long after the headlines have faded and the sensational trials are forgotten, it is his shadow that lingers, a chilling whisper from the past about the true price of power and the enduring allure of the silence in which it most effectively grows. The story of Russell Bufalino is a chilling reminder that history's most powerful currents often run deep beneath the surface. If this journey into the life of the Quiet Don captivated you, if it made you question the official narratives of power, then you won't want to miss our next exploration into the forgotten and hidden corners of history. We delve deep to bring you the full, unvarnished stories you won't find anywhere else. Help us continue to uncover the truth by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting the notification bell so you never miss a story. Your support allows us to keep bringing these complex, detailed narratives to light. Share your thoughts on Bufalino's legacy in the comments below. What do you believe was his greatest secret? What other hidden figures of history should we explore next? Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep looking deeper.